Number 1. Why you don't trust your own judgment. You make hundreds of decisions every day. Some are simple, like choosing what to eat. Others carry weight. What job to take, whether to speak up in a meeting, or how to respond when someone crosses a boundary. But beneath all these decisions lies a quieter question. Do you trust your own judgment? For many, the answer is hesitant or even silent. Not because they lack intelligence or awareness, but because somewhere along the way, self-trust was eroded. And it rarely happens in obvious ways. It's not that someone told you outright that your perspective was wrong. More often, it's shaped by subtle, repeated messages. Don't be so sensitive. That's not a big deal. You're overreacting. These phrases seem harmless at first, but when echoed often enough, by parents, teachers, friends, or even your own inner voice, they teach you to second-guess what you see, feel, and know. Self-doubt becomes habitual. You might replay conversations, searching for what you should have said. You might hesitate before making even simple choices, seeking reassurance or waiting for a sign. And when things go wrong, your first instinct might be to blame yourself. Not because you're always at fault, but because your mind has been conditioned to believe that your perception is flawed. This doesn't mean you failed. It means you've adapted. When a child consistently receives the message that their feelings are too much or that their questions are inconvenient, they don't stop feeling or wondering. They just learn to suppress the expression of those feelings and questions. Over time, the suppression becomes silence. And in adulthood, that silence turns into internal conflict, an ongoing tension between what you feel and what you're supposed to feel. The consequences ripple outward. In relationships, you may tolerate behavior that hurts you because you're unsure whether your discomfort is valid. At work, you might hold back your ideas, afraid they're not good enough, or that someone else must know better. In personal decisions, you might over-research or delay action, convinced there's a right answer somewhere outside of you, if only you could find it. This external orientation is exhausting. It trains your brain to prioritize what others think, expect, or approve of, rather than what aligns with your own values and understanding. And the more you rely on external feedback, the more distant your internal compass feels. Like a muscle left unused, your intuitive sense weakens, not because it's gone, but because it's out of practice. Rebuilding self-trust isn't about becoming perfectly confident. It's about reestablishing a relationship with your own mind. That begins with small acts of internal listening. Notice how you feel after a conversation. Pay attention to what energizes you and what drains you. When you hesitate, ask yourself, not just what others might think, but what feels coherent to you. Often, clarity doesn't arrive in the form of certainty. It comes as a quiet consistency. You start to recognize patterns. Every time I ignore that uneasy feeling, I end up regretting it. Or, when I speak honestly, even if it's awkward, I feel more grounded afterward. These small moments become data points, not based on fear or conformity, but on lived experience. Still, doubt will arise. That's moral. But instead of treating doubt as a stop sign, you can treat it as an invitation to slow down, to examine, and then to choose. The point isn't to eliminate doubt entirely. It's to act anyway, knowing that you are allowed to make imperfect decisions. You are allowed to adjust. And most importantly, you are allowed to learn by doing, not just by analyzing. Some people avoid trusting themselves because they fear the cost of being wrong. But the real cost comes from never choosing, from outsourcing your authority, from living in a loop of hesitation and regret. In contrast, self-trust doesn't guarantee perfect outcomes. It guarantees alignment. You start making choices, right or wrong, are fully yours. And with each aligned decision, no matter how small, you build evidence. Evidence that you can listen to yourself, that your inner voice, though quiet, is not empty, that your perception, though shaped by history, is still valid. Over time, those scattered moments of confidence begin to connect, not into arrogance, but into clarity. You stop asking, "What would they do?" and start asking, "What do I know here?" That shift, subtle as it seems, begins to rewire how you move through the world, not as someone waiting for permission, but as someone willing to respond to their own understanding. Because trust doesn't have to be loud. It just has to be real. Number 2. The hidden cost of always being nice. Most people want to be seen as kind. It's a quality often celebrated in childhood, being the one who shares, who cooperates, who doesn't cause trouble. And while genuine kindness is a strength, there's a point where the desire to be nice becomes a performance, a mask worn not out of care, but out of fear. You nod in agreement when you disagree. You offer help even when you're depleted. You laugh at things that aren't funny because it smooths the moment. You say yes before you've had a chance to check whether you mean it. This is not generosity, it's self-erasure. Being nice all the time might sound harmless, even admirable. But the truth is, this kind of niceness often comes at a cost. It costs clarity, it costs authenticity, and over time, it can cost your connection to yourself. When you're always scanning for what others want you to be, you stop asking what you want for yourself. Decisions become calculations. How can I keep the peace? What will make them happy? What can I say that won't offend? The result is a diluted version of your presence, a persona optimized for approval, not truth. And here's the irony. The people who are always nice often carry deep reservoirs of resentment, not because they're bad people, but because they're chronically underexpressed. When your needs are regularly ignored, especially by yourself, they don't disappear, they fester. And what begins as silent sacrifice can turn into quiet bitterness. You find yourself exhausted, not just physically, but emotionally. Not because you're doing too much, but because you're doing so much that contradicts your actual feelings. This doesn't mean you should swing to the opposite extreme, becoming cold or combative. The solution isn't to stop caring, it's to stop contorting. There's a difference between kindness and accommodation. Kindness comes from wholeness, accommodation comes from fear. One is rooted in connection, the other in anxiety. To examine your own patterns, it helps to ask, when I say yes, what part of me is speaking? Is it my grounded self, or is it the part of me that's afraid to disappoint? When I keep quiet, am I choosing peace or just avoiding discomfort? These questions are not meant to produce guilt. They're meant to open space for honesty. Because only when you see the mechanics of your niceness can you begin to untangle it. For many, the roots run deep. Maybe you were taught that being liked is the most important thing. Maybe you were punished for expressing anger. Maybe the people around you only responded well when you were agreeable. If so, your nervous system adapted. You learned that safety is found in staying small, agreeable, and unthreatening. But what keeps you safe as a child can limit you as an adult. You may find it hard to advocate for yourself, even when something matters. You may struggle to set boundaries, not because you lack knowledge, but because some part of you still believes that assertiveness leads to rejection. And so you default to silence, to smiling, to saying it's fine, even when it's not. Reclaiming your voice doesn't mean becoming harsh. It means becoming accurate. It means allowing your outer behavior to reflect your inner truth. Not perfectly, not all at once, but consistently enough that you no longer feel split in two. You begin to say what you mean, not in anger, but in clarity. You begin to say no, not as a punishment, but as a form of care. And when you say yes, it carries weight because it's real. People might react. Some will be surprised. Some might even push back. That's okay. Discomfort is not a sign that you're doing something wrong. It's often a sign that you're doing something different. And different, in this case, means reclaiming the parts of yourself that you've muted to make others comfortable. You don't have to stop being kind, but you might need to redefine what kindness looks like. It might mean being honest, even when it's awkward. It might mean saying, "That doesn't work for me," without a long explanation. It might mean risking misunderstanding in service of deeper understanding later. At first, it feels unnatural. Your mind might flood with doubts. What if they think I'm rude? What if they get upset? But eventually, something shifts. You begin to feel the difference between connection and performance, between being present and being pleasing. And once you taste that difference, you won't want to go back. Because being truly kind doesn't mean being nice at your own expense. It means being whole and offering others the chance to meet you there. Number 3. How you internalized other people's standards. At some point, without even realizing it, you began measuring your life against rules you didn't write. You started chasing goals you didn't choose. You adopted definitions of success, beauty, intelligence, and worth that were handed to you by parents, teachers, media, peers, not because you evaluated them and agreed, but because they were everywhere, repeated, unquestioned, absorbed. This is how internalization works. It's not an active decision. It's a slow sediment of beliefs layered over time. And by the time you're old enough to notice, you're already living by standards that feel personal but were never truly yours. It often begins early. Children are exceptionally attuned to approval. We notice which behaviors earn praise and which invite correction. Maybe you learned that being quiet made adults happy, or that high grades brought attention, or that being helpful, attractive, athletic, or agreeable made you more valuable. And you adjust it, not because you were manipulative, but because your survival, social, emotional, and sometimes physical, depended on it. As those patterns repeat, they become a framework, not just for how you behave, but for how you evaluate yourself. Over time, external standards become internal judgments. You no longer need someone to disapprove of your choices. You've internalized that voice. It lives in your head now, asking, is this good enough? What will they think? Am I being selfish? And you answer it by shaping your life around invisible expectations. These standards are subtle but powerful. You might feel bad for resting, even when you're tired, because you've internalized the idea that productivity equals worth. You might downplay your desires because you've been taught that ambition is arrogant or self-indulgent. You might pursue a relationship, a career, a lifestyle, not because it reflects who you are, but because it matches what you've been told success should look like. And it works until it doesn't. Because even when you win by these standards, the satisfaction is hollow. You reach the goal, but the fulfillment doesn't come. You get the job, the relationship, the approval, and still feel off. This dissonance is not failure. It's a signal, a quiet internal protest against a life built on borrowed definitions. It's worth asking, whose voice shaped your idea of what a good life is? Whose values defined your priorities? Were those voices aligned with your own experiences, your temperament, your curiosities? Or were they simply the loudest ones around you? Unpacking this is not a blame. It's about clarity. Most people who influence us, parents, teachers, communities, do so with the best intentions. They pass on what they know, what helped them, or what they believe will protect us. But just because a standard is well-intended doesn't mean it's well-suited for you. Reclaiming your standards begins with noticing where you feel disconnected. Where in your life do you feel like you're performing? What goals feel obligatory rather than meaningful? What beliefs about success or failure trigger shame rather than reflection? Sometimes you'll discover that what you thought was ambition is actually pressure, that your perfectionism isn't a love of excellence but a fear of judgment, that your politeness isn't about respect but avoidance. These realizations are not easy, but they're freeing, because once you see the difference between your voice and the voices you've absorbed, you can begin to choose. That's the core shift, moving from reaction to authorship, from living by default to living with intention. This doesn't mean abandoning every external influence. It means evaluating them. Some values, when tested, will resonate more deeply. Others will fall away. The goal is not isolation, it's alignment. Rewriting your internal standards doesn't happen overnight. It involves discomfort. You may disappoint people who benefited from your old patterns. You may second-guess yourself. But slowly, you begin to notice a change. You make decisions that reflect your actual needs. You stop chasing things that exhaust you. You stop shrinking to fit someone else's mold. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to trust your internal signals, not because they're always right, but because there's yours. You give yourself permission to evolve, not toward perfection, but toward authenticity. In a world constantly selling you images of who you should be, returning to yourself is a radical act. But it's not loud, it's quiet. It happens in the small decisions, the ones no one else sees. Choosing rest over hustle, choosing honesty over performance, choosing meaning over mimicry. And when those choices add up, your life begins to reflect something real, not borrowed, not performed, but lived. Number 4. The good person complex. Why you avoid conflict. From an early age, many people are taught to associate being good with being agreeable. We're praised for being quiet, polite, easy to manage. We're told not to talk back, not to raise our voice, not to challenge authority. As a result, we learn that to be good is to be compliant, and that conflict is something to be avoided, not understood. Over time, this belief becomes so ingrained that avoiding discomfort feels like the responsible thing to do, even when it costs us clarity, honesty, or self-respect. Avoiding conflict often starts with good intentions. You want to keep the peace. You don't want to hurt anyone's feelings. You convince yourself that letting things slide is a sign of maturity, of kindness. And in some cases, it is. Not every disagreement needs to be voiced. Not every frustration demands confrontation. But when avoidance becomes your default, it starts shaping your relationships and your sense of self. You may find yourself agreeing to things you don't want, smiling when you're uncomfortable, saying it's fine when it isn't. These choices seem small, but they accumulate, and the result is a quiet erosion of authenticity. You begin to show people a version of you that's always agreeable, always calm, always pleasant. And over time, that version becomes a mask that's hard to remove, even when you're alone. What drives this pattern is not cowardice. It's a deep fear that being honest will make you less lovable, that expressing dissatisfaction will make you a burden, that saying no will lead to rejection or abandonment. These fears are not irrational. They're often rooted in past experiences where honesty was punished or vulnerability was met with ridicule or silence. So you adapt. You learn to scan for tension and diffuse it before it escalates. You become the mediator, the peacekeeper, the one who smooths things over. You get good at reading the room, anticipating needs, managing impressions. And for a while, it works. You're liked, you're appreciated. People say you're so easy to be around. But underneath that approval, something else starts to grow: resentment. You begin to feel unseen, not because others are cruel, but because you've made yourself invisible. You've traded authenticity for acceptance, and the cost of that trade becomes harder to ignore. Conflict isn't the enemy. Poorly managed conflict is. Healthy conflict, grounded in respect and honesty, is a form of intimacy. It's how we show people who we really are. It's how we invite others to see our boundaries, our needs, our values. Without conflict, relationships become performances, safe, predictable, but ultimately shallow. Reclaiming your relationship with conflict doesn't mean becoming aggressive or confrontational. It means learning to tolerate discomfort without abandoning yourself. It means understanding that saying no doesn't make you cruel, that disagreeing doesn't make you combative, that expressing a need doesn't make you needy. It starts with small acts, saying, "Actually, I have a different perspective," or "That didn't feel okay to me," or "I need some time to think about it." These moments might trigger anxiety. You might worry you're being difficult. But discomfort is not the same as danger, and the only way to build that tolerance is through practice. You might also discover that some people in your life prefer the version of you that never pushes back. They might resist your changes, try to guilt you, frame your honesty as selfishness. This resistance is not proof that you're wrong. It's proof that your compliance served them, and now it no longer does. The truth is, being a good person has nothing to do with how agreeable you are. It has everything to do with how honest you're willing to be. Real kindness includes boundaries. Real compassion includes truth. And real connection requires the risk of being misunderstood. Learning to engage with conflict means you stop managing other people's emotions at the expense of your own. You stop assuming responsibility for their reactions. You stop editing yourself to keep the peace. And in doing so, you create space, not just for honesty, but for depth. Conversations become more meaningful, relationships become more resilient, and your sense of self becomes less dependent on approval. The good person complex is not about goodness, it's about fear. And moving through that fear requires courage, the kind that doesn't raise its voice, but quietly refuses to disappear. Because authenticity is not a performance, it's a practice. One that starts with a simple truth: you don't have to be agreeable to be good. Number 5. When guilt replaces thinking. Guilt can be useful. It signals that we've crossed a boundary, acted out of alignment with our values, or hurt someone we care about. At its best, guilt is a moral compass. It invites reflection, repair, and responsibility. But for many people, guilt doesn't function as a guide. It functions as a substitute for thought. Instead of helping you reflect on your behavior, it overrides your ability to think clearly about what actually happened. You might find yourself saying, "I feel bad," before you've even identified what, if anything, was wrong. You hesitate to make decisions not because they're unwise, but because they might inconvenience someone. You second-guess your boundaries, your choices, your desires, not because they're harmful, but because they feel selfish. Over time, the line between doing harm and merely disappointing someone begins to blur. This isn't accidental. Many people are conditioned to associate self-assertion with guilt from a young age. When you expressed needs, you were told you were being demanding. When you said no, you were told you were hurting someone's feelings. When you stood up for yourself, you were framed as the source of conflict. The message was clear. Good people put others first, even if it costs them clarity, comfort, or autonomy. Eventually, guilt becomes automatic, not because you've done something wrong, but because you've internalized a belief that your very presence, when not entirely agreeable, is a problem to be managed. And so, instead of evaluating situations with nuance, what are the facts? What do I value? What's fair to everyone involved? You default to guilt. Guilt becomes your signal for action, your metric for morality, your justification for surrender. But guilt, when unexamined, is not wisdom. It's noise. It drowns out your ability to assess a situation with honesty. It turns every boundary into a betrayal, every disagreement into an act of harm, every moment of rest into negligence. This confusion leads to two common outcomes. 1. Paralysis. You hesitate so long over what's right that you make no decision at all. 2. Overcompensation. You try to make up for the guilt by doing more, giving more, agreeing more, until you feel depleted and resentful. The irony is that guilt often masquerades as empathy. You tell yourself you're being thoughtful, that you're putting others first. But in reality, you may be avoiding the discomfort of having to hold your ground. Because it's easier to yield than to risk being seen as selfish. Easier to say yes than to tolerate someone's disappointment. Easier to feel guilty than to feel uncertain. Reclaiming your thinking requires separating guilt from values. Not every guilty feeling reflects a moral failing. Sometimes it reflects a learned response, a script you were given, not one you chose. You were taught that guilt means you're wrong. But the truth is more complicated. Sometimes guilt means you're growing. You're asserting a boundary that wasn't there before. You're saying no without over-explaining. You're choosing what you need even when it's unpopular. And yes, that might feel uncomfortable. But discomfort is not the same as wrongdoing. A useful practice is to pause when guilt arises and ask, what exactly do I feel guilty about? Have I violated a value I truly believe in, or just a social expectation I've internalized? Is someone else's disappointment a sign that I've done harm, or that I've stopped over-functioning in a role that never belonged to me? These questions restore your agency. They shift you from reflex to reflection, and they allow you to make decisions that are both principled and self-honoring. This shift is not easy. Guilt doesn't vanish overnight. It may linger, whispering that you're being unkind, thoughtless, or cold. But your job is not to eliminate guilt entirely. It's to learn how to interpret it, to distinguish between guilt that teaches and guilt that manipulates. You can begin with small acts, turning off your phone without apologizing, declining an invitation without a lengthy explanation, taking a break without justifying your exhaustion. These choices may feel wrong at first, but with time, they build a new internal signal, one that trusts thought over reaction, reflection over assumption. Eventually, guilt loses its grip. It no longer dictates your choices. It becomes what it was meant to be, a signal, not a sentence. And with that space, something else grows, discernment. The ability to think clearly, to act intentionally, to choose not out of fear, but from a place of alignment. Because guilt is not the voice of your conscience. It's the echo of your conditioning. And your mind is capable of much more than echoing. It's capable of understanding. Number 6. Learned helplessness in everyday decisions. At first glance, helplessness seems like a response to overwhelming circumstances, moments when control is truly out of reach. But there's a more subtle, learned version of helplessness that many people carry without realizing it. It doesn't shout, it whispers. It shows up in the daily hesitation to act, the quiet assumption that nothing will change, the thought that trying isn't worth it because the outcome is already decided. Learned helplessness is not a flaw in your personality. It's an adaptation, something your nervous system learned from experience. When efforts to assert control, ask for help, or make a change are repeatedly met with failure, rejection, or dismissal, your brain starts to draw conclusions. One of the most damaging is this: my actions don't matter. And once that belief is in place, it doesn't just apply to the past. It starts to shape how you interpret the present. You might stop trying to speak up in conversations because you assume no one will listen. You might avoid setting goals because you expect to fail. You might defer every decision to someone else, not because they always know better, but because it feels safer not to be responsible. Over time, this passivity doesn't feel like a choice, it feels like truth. What's especially insidious about learned helplessness is how rational it can appear. You tell yourself you're being realistic, that there's no point in getting your hopes up, that it's smarter to wait and see. But what looks like cautious thinking is often something deeper, a belief that effort and outcome are disconnected, that nothing you do will make a difference. This belief can become self-reinforcing. The less you act, the fewer chances you have to experience positive results. The fewer results you see, the more certain you become that action is futile. It's a loop, not a flaw, and breaking it starts not with motivation or inspiration, but with understanding where the loop came from. In childhood or in early adulthood, you may have lived in environments where autonomy was discouraged, where initiative was punished, or where needs were consistently unmet. Even when the circumstances change, your inner world often doesn't update. You might still carry the expectation that asserting yourself will lead to conflict, or that trying something new will lead to failure. So you wait, you defer, you shrink. But there's a cost to this pattern. When you believe your decisions don't matter, life begins to feel like something that happens to you, not something you shape. You stop exploring new possibilities, not because they don't exist, but because you've stopped looking. You might even become dependent on others for basic choices, not out of inability, but out of habit. The solution is not to push through or pretend you're confident. It's to build a new relationship with agency, one small choice at a time. Agency doesn't begin with grand gestures. It begins with reclaiming the space between stimulus and response, with asking, "What do I actually think?" instead of "What should I do?" It's in choosing the slightly harder route, even when the easier one feels safer. Start with the mundane. Choose what you'll eat. Decide how you'll spend the next hour. Make a plan for the week, even if it's flexible. These aren't just logistical acts, they're psychological ones. Every time you make a decision, however small, you send a signal to your nervous system. I can choose, I can act, I can influence my own experience. You won't always get the outcome you want. That's not the point. The goal isn't certainty, it's participation. When you re-engage with your own life, you interrupt the learned belief that effort is pointless. You start to collect new experiences, ones that suggest maybe things can change. Maybe trying is worth it. Maybe your voice, your preferences, and your presence have weight. Some days you'll slip back into the old reflex of passivity. That's normal. Patterns learned for survival don't disappear overnight. But each time you catch yourself in that loop and make even a small choice to break it, you weaken its grip. Learned helplessness isn't a permanent state. It's a story your nervous system tells you to protect you from disappointment. But once you see that story for what it is, not a truth, but a defense, you can begin to write something else. Not with declarations or affirmations, but with decisions. Quiet, consistent decisions that say, "I exist. I choose, I matter." And with each choice, the feeling of helplessness doesn't just fade. It's replaced by something stronger, the quiet return of your own voice. Number 7. Emotional containment and chronic overthinking. Some people are known for their calm. They don't react impulsively. They process things quietly. They appear rational, composed, even unbothered. But beneath that still surface, there's often a storm, a backlog of unexpressed emotion, unprocessed discomfort, and thoughts spiraling with nowhere to go. This is emotional containment, and when it becomes a pattern, it often leads directly into chronic overthinking. Emotional containment is not about maturity or self-regulation, it's about suppression. It usually starts early in environments where emotional expression was unsafe, discouraged, or punished. Perhaps you were taught that anger was disrespectful, that sadness made you weak, that joy needed to be toned down. The message wasn't always explicit, but it was clear. Certain feelings were too much, for others or for the situation. So you learned to shrink them, to file them away, to appear neutral even when something inside you ached to respond. You learned to perform calmness because it kept the peace. But when emotion has no outlet, it doesn't disappear. It gets rerouted into thought. Overthinking is not just a mental habit. It's what happens when emotion tries to find expression through logic. When you don't feel safe feeling something, you try to solve it instead. You replay conversations not to understand them, but to manage the discomfort they left behind. You imagine every possible future scenario, not because planning helps, but because uncertainty feels intolerable. The mind becomes a substitute for feeling. But the mind is not built to carry what the body suppresses. That's why chronic overthinking feels so exhausting. It doesn't bring clarity. It traps you in loops of doubt, second-guessing, rehearsing, explaining. You try to think your way to safety, to approval, to peace. But it never quite arrives, because what's actually needed isn't more thought. It's more feeling, more truth, more permission to acknowledge what's really going on beneath the analysis. Ironically, the more someone overthinks, the more emotionally distant they may appear to others. On the outside, they might seem calculated or cold, but on the inside, they're often overwhelmed, just silently. Their inner world is loud, crowded with questions, imagined dialogues, and suppressed responses. The rational front is a form of armor. It's not that they don't feel, it's that they feel too much and don't know where to put it. To break the cycle of emotional containment and overthinking, you don't need to stop thinking. You need to create space for feeling, without judgment or performance. That means noticing when your mind starts spinning and asking yourself gently, what emotion is underneath this thought? What am I trying not to feel right now? The goal is not to label yourself, but to reconnect with an internal experience you've been trained to bypass. You may find that behind the overthinking is sadness, or anger, or fear, or even a desire that feels too vulnerable to name. Whatever it is, naming it doesn't make it worse. It makes it visible. And once it's visible, you can work with it directly, without detours, without mental gymnastics, without translating it into endless what-ifs. Sometimes expression is the only antidote to overthinking. That might mean journaling honestly, without filtering for coherence. It might mean moving your body in a way that lets the emotion out, through movement, music, breath. It might mean talking to someone, not to fix the feeling, but to share it. Each time you let emotion be felt instead of analyzed, you create a new possibility, that you don't need to think your way through everything, that feeling is not a threat, that presence is more powerful than planning. This doesn't mean abandoning thought or strategy. It means restoring balance. Thought is useful when it flows from emotional clarity. When it becomes a substitute for it, it turns against you. Chronic overthinking is not intelligence gone wrong. It's emotional life in exile. And the invitation is not to exile your mind, but to bring your full self back into the equation. You can still be measured. You can still be thoughtful. But now you can also be honest. And that honesty begins with a simple practice. Instead of asking, "What should I think?" try asking, "What am I feeling?" Not to control it, just to notice, to name, to allow. Emotional containment was a strategy. Overthinking became its echo. But you don't have to live in that echo forever. The present moment has room for more than thoughts. It has room for you. Number 8. Why you apologize even when you're not wrong. There's a particular kind of apology that doesn't come from remorse. It comes from discomfort, from fear, from a deeply rooted instinct to keep things smooth, to avoid tension, to preempt any possibility of disapproval. It's the kind of apology that slips out before you've even registered whether you did something wrong. And sometimes you didn't. You just felt like you might have. Over-apologizing is rarely about ethics. It's about emotion. It's what happens when the internal bar for having done something wrong is set so low that almost any disruption feels like your fault. You bump into someone slightly, "I'm sorry." You speak your opinion in a meeting, "Sorry, just to add." You say no to a request, "I'm really sorry, but I can't." These aren't apologies for wrongdoing. They're apologies for existing with boundaries, preferences, or presence. This reflex often begins in childhood, in environments where emotional tone shifted quickly, or where adults were unpredictable, reactive, or quick to assign blame. When a child grows up not knowing what will trigger an outburst or disappointment, they often develop a kind of internal radar, constantly scanning for cues, trying to keep the atmosphere light, apologizing as a form of control. If I apologize fast enough, maybe this won't turn into something worse. Maybe they'll calm down. Maybe I'll be safe. But that pattern doesn't stay in childhood. It follows you into relationships, into workplaces, into casual interactions where no threat exists, but your nervous system responds as if it does. The apology becomes a ritual of self-minimization, a way to say, "I'm not a problem. Please don't be upset. Please don't leave." There's also a gendered layer to this. In many cultures, women in particular are socialized to be agreeable, to smooth things over, to keep others comfortable even at their own expense. This can lead to a kind of default mode, where expressing disagreement or asserting needs feels like a transgression, and apologies become a lubricant to make those necessary frictions feel less dangerous. But there's a cost. When you apologize for things that don't require it, you subtly reinforce the belief that your presence is disruptive, that your needs are burdensome, that your voice is something that should only be used if it's been softened, qualified, prefaced by an apology. And over time, this erodes self-trust. You begin to question your own right to take up space, to disagree, to hold firm. This doesn't mean you should never apologize. True apologies are powerful. They reflect accountability, maturity, and care. But reflexive apologies, those that emerge from anxiety rather than awareness, don't serve connection. They obscure it, because they're not really about the other person. They're about managing your own internal discomfort. To begin shifting this pattern, it helps to start noticing when the apology arises. Pause. Ask yourself, what exactly am I apologizing for? Did I cause harm? Or am I reacting to the possibility that someone might feel something I don't want them to feel? Then consider an alternative. Instead of, "I'm sorry I'm late," try, "Thank you for waiting." Instead of, "Sorry, I just thought," here's what I'd like to add. These are small changes, but they send a different message to others and to yourself. Sometimes over-apologizing is also a way to preempt rejection. If I say sorry first, maybe you won't think badly of me. Maybe I can control how you see me. But that control is an illusion. People don't respect you more because you apologize excessively. In fact, it often has the opposite effect. It makes you appear unsure, even when you're not. It dilutes the impact of real apologies when they're actually needed. Building awareness around this reflex doesn't mean becoming rigid or defensive. It means becoming intentional. It means learning to distinguish between actual accountability and inherited guilt. It means realizing that presence is not a violation, that saying no is not an offense, that existing in your truth, even when it creates friction, is not something you need to apologize for. This takes time, especially if the habit has deep roots, especially if it once protected you. But the work is not to blame yourself for the reflex. It's to understand it, to thank it for trying to keep you safe, and then, slowly, to let it go. Because you don't need to apologize for being careful, but you also don't need to live as if everything is your fault. You are allowed to speak without shrinking, to disagree without guilt, to take up space without softening every edge. And the more you practice this, the less heavy the world begins to feel, because you're no longer carrying the weight of imagined blame. You're just showing up, fully, without apology. Number 9. How early praise shapes perfectionism. We tend to think of praise as purely positive, something that builds confidence, encourages growth, and affirms a child's developing sense of self. And often it does. But not all praise is created equal. And when praise is tied too tightly to performance, outcomes, or being impressive, it can quietly set the stage for a lifelong struggle with perfectionism. In childhood, praise is more than feedback. It becomes a kind of mirror. When a parent or teacher says, "You're so smart," or "You're such a good boy," or "You always get it right." The child doesn't just hear approval. They absorb a blueprint for identity. They begin to associate being loved or valued with being exceptional, being agreeable, or meeting expectations. Slowly, unconsciously, they start to build their self-worth around achievement. This is especially true when the praise is outcome-focused rather than effort-focused. Saying, "You got an A, you're brilliant," sends a different message than "You worked hard and stayed focused." One ties identity to success. The other reinforces the process. When the emphasis is always on results, mistakes begin to feel like personal failures. Not just errors, but evidence that you're slipping out of worthiness. Over time, this dynamic can create a pressure to perform that feels internal but was shaped externally. You strive not just to do well, but to avoid doing badly. Not because of ego, but because your sense of being enough has become conditional. It now depends on excellence, on approval, on living up to the image others praised you for. And when that image feels at risk, anxiety kicks in. The stakes feel high, not just for the task, but for your identity. This is the quiet seed of perfectionism. It doesn't always look like ambition. Sometimes it looks like avoidance, procrastination, overthinking, never finishing anything because nothing feels good enough. Perfectionism isn't just about doing everything perfectly. It's about fearing what it means if you don't, about avoiding the shame of not meeting the internalized standard that once made people proud of you. Ironically, people who were excessively praised as children often become more fragile in the face of criticism, not because they're entitled, but because they were never taught how to separate performance from personhood. A bad grade, a failed project, a disapproving look, these things don't just sting, they feel like an unraveling, like the entire foundation of who I am is being threatened. This doesn't mean praise is bad, but it matters how and when it's given. When children are only praised for success, they may start to see struggle as failure. But when they're affirmed for resilience, curiosity, and process, they learn that their value isn't tied to always being right or best. It's tied to showing up, trying, and learning. As adults, many perfectionists struggle to break the cycle. They achieve a lot but feel little satisfaction. They're often praised again for being competent, responsible, organized, but it only deepens the trap. Because now they're the dependable one, the one who always delivers. The image persists, and the pressure to maintain it never lets up. Any slip feels like a collapse. Any rest feels like laziness. And the inner critic becomes relentless. Undoing this requires more than stopping the behavior. It means revisiting the belief system underneath it. Asking, what did I learn about success and love? What role did praise play in shaping my identity? When did doing well start to feel like a condition for being safe, accepted, or seen? And then, slowly, introducing a new form of self-recognition, one that honors the effort, not just the outcome, that allows for rest without guilt, that sees mistakes not as evidence of failure, but as signs of engagement. A life without errors isn't a life of excellence. It's a life of avoidance, of safety, of control, but not necessarily growth. If you were shaped by early praise, your perfectionism isn't a flaw. It's a strategy, one that helped you navigate approval, avoid shame, and stay connected. But you no longer need that strategy to be okay. You're allowed to do well without proving anything. You're allowed to do poorly without losing anything. And you're allowed to step away from the chase, not because you're giving up, but because you're finally stepping into something more honest. A self that doesn't need to be impressive to be worthy.
Number 10. Self-doubt as a habit, not a trait. We often speak about self-doubt as if it were a fixed part of our personality, something we're born with or stuck with, like eye color or height. But self-doubt is not a trait. It's a learned pattern. A habit of thought that becomes more automatic over time, especially if it was reinforced during moments when you needed support but received skepticism instead. From a young age, we're constantly interpreting feedback, spoken and unspoken, from the world around us. When your questions were dismissed, your ideas interrupted, or your instincts second-guessed, the message wasn't just that you were wrong. The deeper imprint was that your inner voice couldn't be trusted, that your feelings, impressions, or decisions required outside validation to be considered real or valid. Over time, this can lead to a fractured sense of agency. Even in adulthood, you might find yourself hesitating before making simple choices. Should I say this? Should I do that? What if it's the wrong move? You scan the room for reactions, replay conversations, and look for clues that you're still on the right track. But there is no track, just a deep, ingrained script telling you that someone else knows better than you do. This script doesn't form in isolation. It's often the result of environments where confidence was punished, independence was discouraged, or mistakes were met with ridicule. In such environments, it's safer to doubt yourself, safer to defer, safer to ask for permission, because trusting yourself was never modeled as a valid option. So you internalized caution, not as a momentary check, but as a permanent posture. That posture becomes familiar, so familiar in fact that it starts to feel like humility, or realism, or thoughtfulness. And while those are all valuable traits, they're not the same as chronic self-questioning. True humility still leaves room for confidence. True realism still allows for trust in your judgment. But self-doubt, when it becomes habitual, eclipses those possibilities. It narrows your range of action, not out of lack of capability, but out of learned hesitation. And the danger isn't just that self-doubt feels bad. The danger is that it shapes the life you build. It leads you to avoid opportunities unless you're 100% certain. It makes you seek excessive reassurance, which can exhaust relationships. It encourages perfectionism, because you believe even a small mistake will confirm your worst fears, that you never really knew what you were doing. Even worse, it creates a feedback loop. The more you second-guess yourself, the less experience you get making autonomous choices. The less experience you have, the more insecure you feel. And the cycle continues, not because you're incapable, but because you've trained your mind to expect uncertainty. But here's the truth. Habits can be unlearned. Not all at once and not without effort, but gradually, through intentional experience. You begin by noticing the pattern. When you hesitate, when you seek reassurance, when you talk yourself out of action. And instead of shaming that moment, you name it. This is the habit. You recognize it not as truth, but as conditioning. From there, you experiment with micro-decisions, small moments where you act without overthinking. You choose your lunch without polling your friends. You speak in a meeting without perfect phrasing. You send the email without rereading it 5 times. These aren't just choices, they're reps. Each one strengthens a muscle that's been underused, the muscle of self-trust. Over time, the discomfort begins to fade. You realize that doubt is not a warning sign. It's just an echo, a ghost of the old environment, not a signal of present danger. And as that ghost loses volume, something else grows louder, your own voice. Not because it's infallible, but because it's familiar. And in a world full of noise, learning to hear yourself again is an act of courage. Reframing self-doubt as a habit doesn't mean you'll never feel uncertain again. It means you'll stop treating that uncertainty as evidence that you're broken. You'll begin to see it as a remnant of your history, not a reflection of your worth or ability. And with practice, you'll discover that the opposite of doubt isn't confidence, it's clarity. Clarity doesn't always come with certainty, but it comes with direction. And sometimes that's enough. Enough to take the next step. Enough to stop waiting for the perfect moment. Enough to trust that even if you're unsure, you'll figure it out along the way. Because in the end, self-trust isn't about always being right. It's about giving yourself permission to be human and still move forward.
Number 11. The illusion of choice in high-stress moments. We like to believe we're rational beings, that we weigh our options, consider outcomes, and then choose. But this belief often doesn't hold up in real time, especially in moments of high stress. Under pressure, your mental bandwidth narrows. Your nervous system shifts from calm reflection to rapid survival mode. And in that state, what feels like a choice is often a reflex, an automatic response based on old patterns, not present possibilities. The human brain is not wired to explore nuance when it feels threatened. It's wired to reduce ambiguity, to pick the fastest, most familiar path to safety. That might mean people-pleasing, shutting down, deflecting, becoming aggressive, or deferring to authority. These aren't conscious decisions. They're reactions coded into your nervous system, often long before you ever had language to describe them. Consider a scenario. You're confronted unexpectedly in public. Your heart races. Your breathing shortens. You nod, smile, and agree, even though everything in you disagrees. Later, you wonder why you didn't speak up. You might criticize yourself for being weak or for not standing your ground. But the truth is, in that moment, you didn't choose silence. Silence chose you. It was the most accessible pathway to safety, based on your internal programming. This phenomenon is known as state-dependent behavior. When you're calm, you have access to your full cognitive range, reasoning, memory, creativity. But when you're under stress, your options shrink. You default to what's familiar, not because it's right, but because it's encoded. And the more often you respond that way, the more that neural pathway gets reinforced. The result is a loop: high-stress situation, habitual response, regret, self-blame. But blaming yourself misses the deeper insight. The real issue isn't weakness, it's a lack of access. Your brain, in those moments, simply doesn't allow certain choices to enter your awareness. Not because you're incapable, but because your system is trying to protect you the best way it knows how. The illusion of choice under stress has profound implications. It explains why we often repeat behaviors we consciously dislike, why we fall into the same arguments, make the same mistakes, or freeze when we promised ourselves we'd act differently. It's not that you didn't want to change, it's that your capacity to choose shrank at the exact moment you needed it most. Breaking this cycle doesn't begin with willpower. It begins with awareness. Start by noticing when your body enters a stress response. Do your shoulders tense? Does your voice tighten? Does your thinking feel rushed or rigid? These are signs that your decision-making is shifting into autopilot. Naming this moment interrupts the script. It creates a sliver of space, just enough to ask, am I reacting or am I choosing? From that space, you can begin to build new associations. The key is to practice when you're not under pressure. Rehearse alternate responses in safe environments. Visualize yourself speaking calmly, setting a boundary, or pausing before replying. These small rehearsals aren't meaningless. They're rewiring your brain to recognize that more than one response exists. Over time, this expands your repertoire, so that next time stress hits, you don't just default, you have options. It's also helpful to reflect on the origin of your reflexes. Did you learn to appease as a child to avoid conflict? Did you learn to stay silent because it felt dangerous to be wrong? Understanding where these patterns come from doesn't excuse them, but it contextualizes them. And that context removes shame. It turns judgment into inquiry. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" you begin asking, "What did this reaction once protect me from?" This shift is crucial, because when you stop seeing stress responses as personal failures, you gain the freedom to work with them, not against them. You stop demanding perfection and start practicing regulation, breathing deeply, grounding your body, slowing your speech. These are small acts, but they send powerful signals to your brain. We're safe, we can slow down, we can choose. And gradually, the illusion of choice becomes real choice. You start to act with more intention, even in difficult moments. You pause before reacting. You notice your urge to flee or please, And sometimes you do something different. Not because it's easy, but because now you know that possibility exists. That's what growth looks like. Not a total transformation overnight, but a widening of the inner space where choices live. And in that space, agency is born. Not just an idea, but as an embodied experience. A felt sense that you are not bound to your past reactions. That stress doesn't own you. That even in pressure, you can remember who you are and what you value. You don't need to master this all at once. You only need to begin noticing the difference between reflex and response. That small recognition, that moment of pause, is the seed of real freedom. And the more often you water it, the more it grows. Because choice, real choice, doesn't scream. It whispers. And now you're learning how to listen.
Number 12. Cognitive dissonance. Why you justify what you don't believe. You've likely experienced the discomfort of doing something that didn't quite align with what you believe. You might have told a lie to avoid tension, defended a decision you knew was flawed, or stayed silent when your values were challenged. Later, you felt a strange tension, a mental itch that something didn't sit right. That discomfort is called cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is the internal conflict that arises when your actions and beliefs are out of sync. It's not just a philosophical dilemma, it's a biological response. Your brain is wired to seek coherence. When it senses contradiction, it activates a kind of alarm system. This tension can be subtle, like background noise, or it can be loud, taking the form of anxiety, guilt, or mental exhaustion. To reduce this tension, the mind looks for quick resolution. And one of the fastest ways to resolve dissonance is to adjust your beliefs to fit your behavior. If you do something that contradicts your values, it's easier to rationalize your actions than to admit you've compromised something core. So the mind gets to work rewriting the narrative. It wasn't a lie, it was just protecting someone's feelings. It wasn't really wrong, everyone does it. I didn't have a choice, I was under pressure. These justifications aren't always dishonest. Sometimes they're necessary. They help you function in complex social environments where no option feels entirely right. But over time, if you continually justify actions that contradict your deeper self, you start to erode the boundary between your values and your habits. You lose track of what you actually believe and start believing whatever is easiest to live with. This is how people end up defending systems they once questioned, supporting behaviors they used to condemn, or remaining in roles that don't reflect who they are. Not because they lack integrity, but because their mind chose psychological comfort over emotional honesty. That trade-off happens silently, often without conscious awareness. One classic example is found in the workplace. Imagine an employee who sees unethical behavior at their company. They feel it's wrong, but they also fear speaking out. So they stay quiet. That silence creates dissonance. I believe in honesty, but I'm not being honest. To reduce that tension, the mind offers relief. It's not my responsibility. Maybe it wasn't that bad. Someone else will probably say something. Over time, the person starts to genuinely believe the new story, even if it once felt foreign. Another example lies in consumer behavior. You value sustainability, but you purchase something you know was made unethically. To resolve the dissonance, your mind offers justifications. It was on sale. I'll do better next time. One purchase doesn't make a difference. These mental maneuvers aren't signs of hypocrisy. They're signs of how deeply your mind craves internal consistency. This mechanism isn't unique to individuals. It operates at cultural levels too. Entire societies justify contradictory behaviors to avoid facing painful truths. History is full of examples where dissonance was resolved not by changing the behavior, but by changing the narrative. And the more often a story is repeated, the more natural it feels, regardless of its accuracy. Recognizing cognitive dissonance in yourself doesn't mean you failed. It means you're awake. The real work begins when you notice the moment of discomfort and pause.
Ask yourself, what story am I telling to make this feel okay? That question opens a doorway, not to judgment, but to clarity. From there, you have a choice. You can acknowledge the tension and explore what it's teaching you. Maybe your behavior needs to shift. Maybe your beliefs need to evolve. Or maybe both. Either way, the goal isn't perfection. It's alignment. And alignment begins with honesty, not just with others, but with yourself. One powerful practice is journaling your dissonant moments. Don't aim to solve them immediately, just observe them. Over time, patterns emerge. You'll notice which situations trigger the most internal conflict. That awareness is gold. It reveals the friction points between your values and your environment. Sometimes, resolving dissonance means making difficult changes, leaving a job, ending a relationship, admitting you were wrong. These choices carry discomfort, but they also restore coherence. And coherence creates peace. Not the peace of avoidance, but the peace of self-respect. Other times, resolution comes through compassion, recognizing that you made the best choice available with the resources you had, that your past decisions don't define your future integrity. That contradiction is part of growth. What matters most is that you stay curious. Dissonance isn't a sign you're broken. It's a sign you're becoming more conscious. And with consciousness comes freedom. The freedom to examine your assumptions, rewrite your stories, and live more in tune with what you truly believe. You don't need to get it perfect. You just need to notice when the story no longer fits. Because the moment you feel that internal shift, the subtle dissonance, you've already begun the process of returning to yourself.
Number 13. Mental scripts you don't know you're following. Much of what you do each day feels like a choice. You wake up, make decisions, interact with others, and respond to events as if you're actively directing your behavior. But beneath that surface of conscious intention runs a series of invisible instructions, mental scripts you've internalized, not by reasoning through them, but by absorbing them through repetition, modeling, and reward. They don't feel like scripts, they feel like you. A mental script is a pre-written pattern for how to think, feel, or act in certain situations. You don't consciously choose these scripts. They're installed over time through cultural norms, family dynamics, educational systems, and personal experiences. And once internalized, they operate like background programs, automating your responses before you've had a chance to think. Consider how you respond to praise. Some people deflect it automatically. Oh, it was nothing. Anyone could have done it. Others light up and let it sink in. The difference is rarely about personality. It's about the script they've learned. One script says, "Pride is dangerous, stay humble." Another says, "Acknowledging your strengths is healthy." These scripts shape not just what you say, but how you see yourself. Or take conflict. Maybe you feel an urge to resolve tension quickly, even if it means compromising what you want. That urge likely didn't begin with a single decision. It came from repeated exposure to environments where harmony was valued over honesty. Over time, you absorbed a script. Discomfort equals danger. Keep the peace. You didn't choose that logic. It was embedded. Scripts can also guide your career choices, your sense of worth, your ideas about success. A person who grew up being praised for productivity may carry a script that says your value depends on what you produce. So they work late, feel guilty resting, and struggle to enjoy downtime, not because they want to be busy, but because the script has linked activity to identity. What makes these scripts so powerful is their invisibility. You don't question them because they operate before conscious awareness. They're not loud commands, they're quiet assumptions. And because they blend into your inner voice, it's hard to distinguish them from your own authentic preferences. But scripts are not destiny. They're patterns. And like any pattern, they can be seen, studied, and revised. The first step is detection. Start by observing moments where your response feels automatic, especially when it leads to discomfort, confusion, or regret. Ask yourself, what did I believe in that moment? Not just what you thought, but what deeper instruction you were following. Often, the script will surface. It might sound like, if I say no, I'm selfish. If I rest, I'm lazy. If I speak up, I'll be punished. Once identified, the script can be questioned. Where did it come from? Is it true? Who benefits from you believing it? What alternative script could you explore? For example, replacing "if I'm not productive, I'm worthless" with "my worth isn't tied to constant output" creates space for different choices. Choices aligned with well-being, not performance. Another way to uncover scripts is to notice your emotional patterns. Guilt, resentment, or shame often indicate that a script is being triggered. For instance, if you feel guilty for asking for help, it may point to a script like "independence equals strength." If you feel resentment when others don't notice your needs, the underlying script could be "if I'm good, others will automatically understand me." These unspoken assumptions are often unrealistic, but you live by them until they're named. Scripts also tend to surface in relationships. You might find yourself playing roles: caretaker, peacemaker, fixer, not because you consciously chose them, but because they feel expected. Examining those roles reveals deeper instructions. My needs come last. I'm only lovable if I'm useful. Recognizing the script is the first act of freedom. Importantly, discarding a script doesn't mean rejecting your past. It means updating your mental operating system to match your current self. You're allowed to revise the rules. You're allowed to choose different defaults. And doing so isn't betrayal, it's maturity. Creating new scripts requires intention. It involves experimenting with new behaviors, listening for discomfort, and staying curious when the old instructions try to pull you back. With repetition, new scripts begin to take root. They might start out fragile, but they grow stronger each time you act from them. The goal isn't to become script-free. That's not possible. The mind works through patterns. But the more conscious you become of your internal scripts, the more power you have to shape them. Instead of being directed by invisible narratives, you begin to author your own. And in that shift, from unconscious obedience to conscious authorship, you begin to live a life that's less about managing expectations and more about expressing who you are becoming.
Number 14. Why familiar problems feel safer than new solutions. There's a strange paradox in human behavior. You'd think that people naturally move away from discomfort toward relief, that suffering would push us to change, and solutions would always feel like progress. But the reality is more complicated. Often, we hold tightly to what hurts us, not because we like the pain, but because the pain is familiar. Familiarity brings a sense of control. Even when a situation is unsatisfying or emotionally draining, if you've lived with it long enough, your mind treats it as known territory. You've mapped its contours. You know when the tension will spike. You know how to manage the damage. That predictability gives a strange sense of safety, one that new experiences, even positive ones, don't always provide. Imagine someone who constantly feels unappreciated at work. They know how that feels. They know how to silently endure, how to perform anyway, how to avoid confrontation. Now imagine they get a new job where they're finally seen and valued. You'd expect relief. But what may surface instead is anxiety, suspicion, discomfort. Not because the new situation is worse, but because the script of "I'm invisible" no longer applies, and the brain doesn't know what to replace it with. This is why people sometimes sabotage their own growth. It's not always about laziness, fear of failure, or lack of motivation. Sometimes it's about the nervous system seeking the emotional climate it's used to, even if that climate is painful. That's how patterns repeat. Not because they're pleasant, but because they're encoded. When the brain learns from experience, it doesn't ask if something is good. It asks if it's familiar. Familiar equals survivable. It's not optimal, it's not joyful, but you lived through it before, and that makes it less threatening than the unknown. This shows up in relationships. Someone who grew up in a home where love was conditional, where affection was tied to performance, may find themselves repeatedly drawn to partners who are emotionally withholding, not because they want neglect, but because their mind associates inconsistency with connection. A partner who offers stable love might feel off, even suspicious, because it doesn't match the emotional blueprint they carry. Or take problem solving. You might be stuck in a cycle of overthinking, knowing that action is the only real way forward. But taking action means embracing uncertainty. Thinking, on the other hand, even if it leads nowhere, feels like a kind of safety net. It gives you the illusion of progress without the risk of exposure. Even pain can become a comfort zone if it has shaped your identity. If you've always seen yourself as the fixer, the survivor, or the one who carries others, then healing may threaten your self-concept. Who are you when you're not in crisis? What do you do when you're not fixing? The discomfort of those questions can keep you tethered to roles you've outgrown. This doesn't mean people want to stay stuck. Most don't. But there's a difference between wanting change and being emotionally ready for it. Real change often feels disorienting, not because it's bad, but because it's unfamiliar. And until you name that dynamic, you might interpret the discomfort of change as a sign that it's wrong, when really it's a sign that your nervous system is adjusting to new territory. So how do you begin to shift? First, by noticing when comfort is coming from familiarity rather than health. Ask yourself, do I feel safe because this situation supports me, or because it's what I've known for so long? That question alone can loosen the grip of unconscious loyalty to old pain. Second, by practicing emotional tolerance for unfamiliar good things. That means staying in situations that feel positive but strange, letting praise land without deflecting it, sitting with calm instead of creating chaos, allowing closeness without retreating. It's not about pretending to be comfortable. It's about giving your system time to rewire. Third, by rewriting your internal definitions. Maybe your brain learned that love equals inconsistency, that productivity equals value. These definitions aren't fixed. You can teach yourself new ones through repeated experience, reflection, and choice. And fourth, by acknowledging the grief that comes with letting go of old patterns. Even when they were painful, they were yours. They helped you survive. Releasing them doesn't mean they were worthless. It means you're ready for something different, something better. Over time, new patterns become familiar. The silence that once felt eerie begins to feel like peace. The respect you didn't know how to receive begins to feel deserved. The rest you used to avoid begins to feel like a right. And the life you once imagined from a distance begins to feel like it belongs to you. Not because it's perfect, not because it's easy, but because you finally stopped mistaking the known for the good. Number 15. The comfort of certainty over truth. We often think of truth as something we naturally seek. We imagine ourselves as curious creatures, hungry for knowledge and eager to discover what's real. But in practice, what most people seek first isn't truth, it's certainty. Not because certainty is more accurate, but because it's more emotionally satisfying. It feels solid, final, safe. And in a world full of contradictions and complexity, that feeling can become addictive. Certainty simplifies life. It turns confusing questions into clear answers, complex people into neat categories, and unpredictable outcomes into stories with obvious villains and heroes. When something is certain, it doesn't require effort to hold. You don't need to update your understanding or adjust your expectations. You just cling to the conclusion, and it becomes a lens through which everything else is filtered. That lens is comforting, but it can also be blinding. Because once certainty takes hold, your mind starts protecting it. Not by seeking more truth, but by avoiding anything that threatens what you already believe. This is why people will ignore evidence, rewrite memories, or dismiss new information that doesn't align with their current view. It's not about being dishonest, it's about emotional survival. When your identity is built on a belief, challenging that belief feels like self-destruction. This shows up in subtle ways. You might resist feedback not because you think you're always right, but because questioning your choices feels like admitting you're fundamentally flawed. Or you might avoid changing your mind in a debate, not because the new point isn't valid, but because agreeing would mean losing the identity of the one who knows. It's not just about ego, it's about stability. In moments of stress, grief, or uncertainty, people often cling hardest to the beliefs they hold most tightly, not because they're the most rational, but because they're the most familiar. Beliefs become emotional anchors, and letting go of one, even if it no longer serves you, can feel like floating in open water with no land in sight. This is especially true when it comes to beliefs about yourself. If you've spent years thinking, "I'm not good enough," or "I always mess things up," those beliefs become stable points around which your sense of self is organized. Even if they're painful, they provide structure. Challenging them feels risky, not just intellectually, but existentially. Who are you if that belief is no longer true? That's why change often begins with emotional flexibility, not cognitive argument. People don't shift their thinking just because they hear a better idea. They shift when they feel safe enough to loosen their grip on the old one. That safety doesn't come from pressure or confrontation. It comes from trust, time, and the repeated experience of being able to survive uncertainty without losing yourself. Because uncertainty isn't the enemy. In fact, uncertainty is where growth begins. It's the space between the old story and the new one. It's the pause between reaction and insight. And while it may feel disorienting, it's also where you're most alive, most awake to possibility, most able to see things as they are rather than how you wish they were. Truth, unlike certainty, doesn't promise comfort. It doesn't come with guarantees. Sometimes it exposes flaws. Sometimes it requires change. But it also frees you. Because when you face the truth about yourself, your relationships, your patterns, you're no longer managing a fantasy. You're engaging with what's real. And in that reality, you can make choices that actually matter. So, how do you begin to trade certainty for truth? First, by noticing when you're clinging to a belief simply because it feels safe. Ask yourself, do I believe this because it's true or because I've believed it for so long? That question won't give you an instant answer, but it will open a door. Second, by practicing the art of pause. When someone challenges your thinking, or when you encounter new information, don't rush to reject or accept it. Sit with it. Let it exist in your awareness without forcing it into your existing categories. That pause is where perspective grows. Third, by allowing multiple truths to exist. Most realities aren't binary. You can be both kind and selfish, both strong and uncertain, both right and incomplete. Holding paradox is part of maturing. It makes your thinking more robust, more nuanced, more resilient. Finally, by building your identity not on fixed conclusions, but on ongoing inquiry. Define yourself not by what you know, but by your willingness to learn. Not by the firmness of your opinions, but by the integrity of your curiosity. Because in the long run, truth may not always feel good, but it will always give you back your agency. Not a tidy answer, not a perfect story. Just the clarity to live without illusion.
Number 16. Selective attention. Seeing only what confirms you. Your brain is not a camera. It doesn't passively record reality. It filters it, constantly, automatically, and unconsciously. At any given moment, you are surrounded by more sensory information than your conscious mind could ever process. Colors, sounds, movements, faces, textures, ideas. To avoid overload, your brain prioritizes. And what it chooses to notice first is not what's objectively most important. It's what aligns with what you already believe. This mechanism is called selective attention. It's the process by which your mind sifts through a flood of input and locks on to what seems relevant. But relevance, in psychological terms, is defined not by objective truth but by personal meaning. And personal meaning is shaped by your past, your fears, your expectations, and your unresolved narratives. Think about a moment when you were feeling insecure about something: your appearance, your intelligence, your social standing. In that state, if someone glanced at you briefly and looked away, your brain might register it as rejection. If someone laughed across the room, your mind might assume they were laughing at you. None of this is based on evidence. It's based on the emotional lens you're wearing. And selective attention ensures you only see the details that reinforce that lens. This is why people can live in the same world but experience entirely different realities. A confident person in a meeting hears critical feedback and registers it as a growth opportunity. A self-doubting person hears the same comment and interprets it as humiliation. Same words, same tone, different attention filters. Selective attention is not just about what you see. It's also about what you don't. You might miss praise because you're expecting criticism. You might overlook opportunities because you're focused on threats. You might ignore kindness because your mind is trained to spot betrayal. Over time, this skews your perceptions so thoroughly that it begins to feel like the world is confirming your worst assumptions. And that's the danger. You believe your conclusions are based on what you observed. But really, you observed what supported your conclusions. It's not that your beliefs are being tested by the evidence. It's that the evidence is being selected to fit your beliefs. This creates a kind of psychological loop. You feel a certain way. That feeling influences what you notice. What you notice reinforces how you feel. And so it goes, deepening the groove of the narrative you already carry. Breaking this loop starts with becoming aware of the filter itself. Most people don't realize their attention is selective. They assume that what they notice is what matters, and what they don't notice simply isn't there. But attention is not neutral. It's directed. And the one directing it is not your conscious self. It's your subconscious, shaped by years of emotional conditioning. So how do you change what you see? It begins with questions. When something provokes a strong emotional reaction, ask yourself, what else might be true here that I'm not seeing? Not to dismiss your feelings, but to widen your frame. Maybe that look wasn't rejection. Maybe that silence wasn't judgment. Maybe that delay wasn't avoidance. When you entertain multiple interpretations, you dilute the power of the one that hurts most. Another strategy is to intentionally shift your focus. If your mind is trained to find what's wrong, spend time actively noticing what's working. This isn't about forced positivity. It's about balancing the narrative. If you've spent years collecting evidence that people don't care, start looking for the exceptions. Write them down, say them out loud. Not because they erase the pain, but because they interrupt the autopilot. Mindfulness practices can also help. When you train your attention through meditation or breath work, you begin to see your thoughts as events, not as facts. This creates space between stimulus and interpretation, and in that space, your awareness can grow. Finally, it helps to talk to people who see the world differently. Not to debate them, but to borrow their eyes for a moment. Ask them how they interpreted something you experienced. You might be surprised to find that your version of events is not the only one that makes sense. That realization can be quietly transformative.
Because once you understand that your perception is shaped by attention, and that attention is shaped by belief, you gain access to something powerful, the ability to shift both. You are not trapped by your perspective. You are simply living within it. And the more aware you become of your attention, the more choice you have in where to place it next. Not to manipulate reality, but to see it more fully. To expand what's possible. To notice what you used to ignore. And maybe, just maybe, to start believing something better.
Number 17. The invisibility of confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is not a flaw exclusive to those who are uninformed or closed-minded. It's a feature of how the human brain has evolved to make sense of the world. This bias, the tendency to seek out, interpret, and remember information that confirms what we already believe, is subtle, pervasive, and largely invisible to the person experiencing it. And yet, it influences nearly every decision you make and every conclusion you draw. At its core, confirmation bias is a mental shortcut. The brain, faced with an overwhelming amount of information, needs ways to reduce complexity. Instead of re-evaluating every belief in light of new data, it looks for coherence. It favors familiarity. It defaults to what feels true, not necessarily what is true. This is efficient, but it's not always accurate. For example, if you hold the belief that you're not good at relationships, you'll unconsciously notice and emphasize every interaction that supports that narrative. A partner's momentary distance is read as emotional withdrawal. A disagreement is interpreted as evidence of incompatibility. Kindness might be seen as temporary or manipulative. You don't do this deliberately. Your attention is simply drawn to the pieces that fit the story you already tell yourself. What makes confirmation bias so difficult to detect is that the evidence you gather feels self-validating. You think, of course I believe this, just look at what's happened. But what's happened isn't random, it's filtered. Your perceptions, your interpretations, even your memories are shaped by what your mind was already expecting to find. And it doesn't stop there. Confirmation bias also affects how you recall the past. You're more likely to remember experiences that support your current beliefs, and forget those that contradict them. If you believe you've always been unlucky, you'll recall every setback with vivid clarity and downplay or overlook the times things worked out. Over time, your memory becomes a curated narrative, one that feels real but is deeply selective. This becomes especially dangerous when it comes to relationships, identity, and self-worth. If you believe you're not worthy of love, you'll notice indifference more than affection. If you believe you're not intelligent, you'll focus on your mistakes and discount your insights. The bias doesn't just affect what you think, it shapes what you're even able to see. It's important to understand that confirmation bias is not a conscious lie. You're not deceiving yourself intentionally. Your brain is trying to protect you from cognitive dissonance, the discomfort that arises when new information challenges your worldview. So it smooths over the contradictions. It simplifies the picture, and in doing so, it can keep you stuck. So how do you challenge something that hides so well? Start by treating your beliefs as hypotheses, not truths. Ask yourself, what would I notice if the opposite of this belief were true? If you think people don't respect you, look for signs of respect. Not to convince yourself of something false, but to test whether your current lens is incomplete. It also helps to seek out perspectives that differ from your own. This doesn't mean agreeing with everyone. It means listening with the intent to understand, not to defend. When you hear someone describe the world in a way that challenges your assumptions, resist the urge to immediately argue or dismiss. Instead, ask, what would have to be true for this perspective to make sense? Another strategy is to reflect on past beliefs you no longer hold. Consider ideas you once felt certain about but later abandoned. What changed? What allowed you to shift? Remembering that your thinking has evolved before can make it easier to accept that it might evolve again. You can also use writing as a tool. When you notice a strong reaction to something, a post, a comment, an interaction, write down what you believe and why. Then ask yourself, is there another explanation I haven't considered? By putting thoughts into words, you create space between you and the automatic assumptions your brain makes. It's also valuable to surround yourself with people who are willing to question your thinking, not to undermine you, but to help you see blind spots. The goal is not to be criticized, but to be seen more clearly. A good question asked with curiosity rather than judgment can interrupt the cycle of self-confirmation. Most importantly, give yourself permission to be wrong. That's not a weakness, it's a skill. The more flexible your beliefs, the more resilient your thinking. The more open your attention, the more complete your understanding. In a world filled with ambiguity and complexity, the ability to change your mind is not a failure of character. It's a mark of maturity. Confirmation bias will always exist. It's part of being human, but awareness makes it less powerful. The more you understand how your mind filters reality, the more choices you have in how you respond to it. Not everything you believe needs to be proven, but everything you believe deserves to be questioned.
Number 18. Why you're drawn to people who reflect your self-image. We often think that attraction, whether romantic, platonic, or professional, is primarily based on shared values or complementary traits. But beneath those surface explanations lies a quieter, more persistent force, self-recognition. You're not just drawn to people who interest you, you're drawn to people who reflect some part of who you believe you are or who you fear you are. This dynamic happens so consistently and so automatically that we rarely question it. Your self-image acts like a psychological filter. It shapes how you interpret others, how you respond to them, and what kind of energy you unconsciously send their way. If you see yourself as someone competent, valuable, and capable of being loved, you're more likely to resonate with people who mirror that respect. Their presence feels validating, not threatening. You feel seen, not because they're neutral, but because they affirm the internal picture you already carry. But if your self-image is distorted, if you see yourself as broken, inferior, or difficult to love, then your internal compass begins to point toward people who confirm those beliefs. It doesn't feel like self-sabotage, it feels familiar. You're not consciously seeking mistreatment or disconnection. You're seeking coherence between who you think you are and how others treat you. Consider someone who believes they are not interesting. In a room full of potential connections, they may be subtly drawn to people who show indifference, not because they enjoy being dismissed, but because it fits the emotional script they know. Validation from someone warm and curious might feel undeserved, even disorienting. The mind clings to what it recognizes, even if it hurts. This doesn't mean your relationships are doomed to repeat painful patterns, but it does mean that the people you're drawn to aren't random. They often serve as mirrors, reflecting back the core assumptions you carry about yourself, assumptions you might not even realize you hold. The effect works in both positive and negative directions. If you start to develop a healthier self-image, your taste in people changes. You become less tolerant of disrespect, not because others have changed, but because your internal reference point has. Interactions that once felt acceptable now feel draining. You begin to notice warmth where you once ignored it, and subtle forms of control or manipulation stand out more clearly. Sometimes this shift feels disorienting. You might ask yourself, why do I feel distant from people I used to be close with? Why do I feel drawn to a different kind of presence, one that doesn't trigger the same old reactions? The answer is simple but powerful. As your sense of self evolves, your internal need for confirmation shifts as well. You no longer require others to confirm your old wounds. You begin to seek out resonance with your healing. There's also a reason why we're sometimes deeply drawn to people who reflect the parts of ourselves we've disowned. You may find yourself fascinated by someone outspoken if you were taught to stay quiet. You may feel an intense pull towards someone emotionally expressive if you've been suppressing your own feelings. This isn't contradiction, it's compensation. Your mind is drawn to what feels missing, and in those people you see a part of yourself trying to return. The challenge is that this attraction can turn into projection. You idealize someone for embodying a quality you haven't fully accepted in yourself. And when they disappoint you, or when the fantasy fades, you might feel betrayed, not by them, but by the version of yourself you saw in them. This is why some of our strongest emotional reactions are not to who people actually are, but to what they represent to us. To change this dynamic, you don't need to change who you're drawn to. You need to understand what that attraction is revealing. Ask yourself, what does this person reflect about the way I see myself? What part of me is looking for confirmation, validation, or reparation? When you become aware of what you're seeking, you gain the power to choose it consciously. Healthy attraction doesn't mean always finding someone who perfectly matches your healed self. It means being able to notice the pull, pause, and ask, is this connection reinforcing an outdated story about who I am, or is it supporting the story I'm trying to grow into? And when you're able to answer that question, not just intellectually, but emotionally, you begin to shift from unconscious repetition to conscious engagement. You stop seeking mirrors and start seeking relationships that expand your self-perception, not just reflect it. You are not always drawn to what you need. Sometimes you're drawn to what you recognize. But the more you understand that pattern, the more you can choose what to keep reflecting and what to leave behind. Number 19. How routine overwrites self-awareness. The human mind is wired to conserve energy, and one of its most efficient tools for doing so is routine. Habits, rituals, and familiar patterns reduce the mental load required to navigate daily life. You don't have to think about how to brush your teeth, prepare your coffee, or get to work. The routine handles it. But the same mechanism that creates efficiency also carries a hidden cost. It can slowly obscure self-awareness. When your days are filled with repetition, you stop noticing not only your surroundings, but yourself. At first, routine feels like grounding. It creates structure, predictability, and a sense of control. But over time, it can become a mental autopilot, blurring the line between intention and inertia. You start doing things not because they reflect who you are, but because they're what you've always done. Familiarity begins to masquerade as preference, and comfort becomes indistinguishable from alignment. It's not uncommon to reach a moment in life and wonder, how did I get here? Why does this job, this relationship, this lifestyle no longer feel like mine? Often, the answer lies not in one dramatic decision, but in a long series of unquestioned repetitions. You didn't choose the life you're living. You drifted into it through the steady erosion of intention. This doesn't happen because you're lazy or unaware. It happens because the brain is built to minimize novelty. Novelty requires effort. It demands attention. And attention is expensive, neurologically speaking. So, the mind learns to automate. But when automation replaces reflection, your life starts to feel disconnected. Not because something is wrong externally, but because you've stopped checking in internally. Routine isn't inherently harmful. In fact, it's necessary for stability. The danger arises when routine becomes identity, when you define yourself by what you do, instead of why you do it, when your days are shaped more by default than by design. One subtle sign of this is the gradual disappearance of curiosity. You stop asking questions, not just about the world, but about yourself. You no longer wonder why you feel restless in certain conversations, why you avoid specific tasks, or why some environments drain you more than others. You interpret discomfort as inconvenience, not information. And in doing so, you lose access to one of your most valuable tools, internal feedback. This erosion of self-awareness doesn't always feel dramatic. Often, it feels like numbness, like walking through your own life with the sound turned down. You're present, but not engaged, functioning, but not fully alive. And because nothing seems explicitly wrong, you don't have a clear reason to change. The absence of pain can mask the absence of meaning. Breaking this cycle doesn't require a radical reinvention. It begins with small, deliberate acts of attention. Noticing when you move through your day without awareness. Asking yourself, what am I feeling right now? What am I avoiding? What am I repeating, and why? Sometimes the answers are uncomfortable. You may discover that your routines were built around coping strategies that no longer serve you. That the structure you created to feel safe is now limiting your growth. That the person you've become is out of sync with the person you once needed to be. These realizations don't have to provoke guilt. They can serve as invitations to update your habits, your assumptions, and your sense of self. You don't have to abandon all routine to regain self-awareness. You only need to reintroduce reflection, to make space for pauses, for reassessment, and for intentional disruption. It could be as simple as taking a different route home, changing your morning rhythm, or setting aside time to ask deeper questions. The goal isn't constant change, it's conscious presence. When you become more aware of your routines, you gain the ability to distinguish between what supports you and what merely persists. You start to recognize which habits reflect your current values and which ones belong to a past version of you. And in that recognition, you create the possibility for reintegration, for bringing your behavior back into alignment with your evolving self. Your life is a collection of patterns, but your identity is not. And the more you notice the difference, the more you can live by choice, not just by momentum.
Number 20. Emotion avoidance disguised as logic. There's a particular type of person who prides themselves on being rational. They favor facts over feelings, clarity over chaos, and logic over emotion. They see emotional reactions as noise, unreliable, unpredictable, and often inconvenient. To navigate life, they lean on analysis. They build mental models, weigh pros and cons, and strive to make sense of every situation before acting. On the surface, this seems wise, but beneath it, there's often a hidden motivation: avoidance. The desire to be logical is not always about seeking truth. Sometimes it's about building a shield, a way to keep messy, uncomfortable emotions at bay. When you frame every decision through the lens of reason, you gain the illusion of control. You don't have to feel overwhelmed by uncertainty because you can organize it. You don't have to acknowledge your disappointment because you've already rationalized why something wasn't meant to be. And you don't have to explore your fear because it's not practical to dwell on it. This kind of logic becomes a strategy, not for understanding the world, but for managing discomfort. You might call it objectivity, but in practice, it's emotional repression in disguise. The problem isn't that logic is being used. It's that it's being used to silence intuition, vulnerability, and the raw truths that logic can't fully contain. Over time, this creates a psychological distance between you and your inner world. You get better at naming what makes sense, but worse at recognizing what hurts. You can explain your choices, but struggle to feel them. And this disconnection can lead to a life that looks fine from the outside, but feels strangely hollow on the inside. You may find yourself asking questions like, why does this achievement feel empty? Why don't I feel more connected in this relationship? Why can't I enjoy what I've earned? The answer often lies in a simple truth. Emotions don't disappear just because you ignore them. They migrate. They show up in restlessness, in burnout, in physical symptoms, and emotional flatness. And they do so not to punish you, but to remind you that something vital has been left out of the conversation. Avoiding emotion through logic is especially common in people who were never taught that emotions have value. Maybe you were told to toughen up, or that crying was weakness. Maybe you learned that feelings caused problems in your family, so you became the calm one, the reasonable one, the fixer. But being composed isn't the same as being whole, and composure that depends on suppression is inherently fragile. Reconnecting with emotion doesn't mean abandoning reason. It means expanding your definition of intelligence. It means recognizing that emotional insight is not a threat to logic, but a complement to it. That you can trust your feelings without being ruled by them. That you can acknowledge discomfort without needing to fix it right away. One way to begin this reintegration is to ask yourself, what emotion might I be avoiding right now? When you're over-explaining, over-analyzing, or seeking perfect clarity before acting, pause. Ask, what would it mean to simply feel this, without resolving it? What am I afraid will happen if I do? These questions are not meant to dismantle your thinking. They're meant to restore balance, to bring your emotional data back online. Because emotions are not obstacles to good decisions. They are signals. They tell you what matters, what hurts, what's missing. And when you ignore them, you cut off access to a part of yourself that's essential for wise action. In the long run, the goal isn't to choose between logic and emotion. It's to learn their rhythm, to notice when you're using reason to clarify and when you're using it to hide, to allow emotion to surface, not as a weakness to be solved, but as a language to be understood. Emotion doesn't make you irrational. Denying it does.
Number 21. The fantasy of mutual understanding. There's a common assumption in human relationships that if we just explain ourselves clearly enough, listen patiently enough, or try hard enough, we'll eventually be fully understood. We think of communication as a bridge, a structure that, if built properly, should connect two minds with perfect symmetry. But this idea, however comforting, is largely an illusion, and clinging to it often creates more frustration than connection. The fantasy of mutual understanding begins with a hidden belief that words alone can carry the full weight of our thoughts, feelings, and intentions. But language is an approximation. It filters internal experience through symbols, cultural norms, and past associations. What you mean and what the other person hears are always slightly out of sync, even when you're being sincere, even when they're trying to understand you. And this gap, the unbridgeable space between what's felt and what's expressed, is not a failure. It's a feature of human cognition. No two people perceive the world in the same way because no two people have lived the same inner life. We all interpret through layers, our emotional histories, our expectations, our fears. So when someone misunderstands you, it doesn't always mean they weren't listening. Sometimes it means they were listening through their own framework, one that cannot fully accommodate yours. This can be especially painful in close relationships. You want your partner or friend or parent to get you, to validate your experience without distortion. And when they don't, it can feel like rejection. But often, the hurt comes not just from the misunderstanding, but from the expectation that they should have understood you perfectly in the first place. What if we let go of that expectation? What if we accepted that misunderstanding is not just possible, but inevitable? This shift doesn't mean giving up on connection. It means redefining what connection actually looks like. Real intimacy doesn't come from perfect understanding. It comes from mutual curiosity, from the willingness to stay engaged, even when clarity feels out of reach, from saying, I may never fully know what it's like to be you, but I want to keep learning. When you drop the fantasy of mutual understanding, something liberating happens. You become less invested in proving your inner world and more open to exploring theirs. You ask better questions. You listen for what isn't said. You stop assuming that agreement is the goal. And you begin to value the attempt to understand over the achievement of it. This mindset also invites more self-compassion, because when you no longer expect others to perfectly grasp your inner life, you stop judging yourself when they don't. You stop chasing approval as validation. You begin to recognize that your truth is still valid even if no one else can fully echo it back to you. This doesn't mean resigning yourself to loneliness. In fact, it often deepens your sense of connection. Because when people feel the freedom to be partially misunderstood and still accepted, they relax. They share more. They listen more generously. They start to treat understanding not as a requirement for love, but as a process of love. Of course, there will be moments when clarity matters. In conflict, in boundaries, in important decisions, precision helps. But even then, it's helpful to remember, the goal is not perfect transmission. It's shared understanding within limits. It's saying, here's how I see it. How does it land with you? It's recognizing that even our clearest sentences are just sketches, and that every conversation is an invitation to revise the drawing together. The fantasy of mutual understanding is seductive because it promises emotional certainty. But real human connection is messier than that. It's full of misfires, restarts, and repairs. And maybe that's the point. Not to eliminate the distance between minds, but to meet each other across it over and over again.
Number 22. Emotional merging, when we replaces me. In close relationships, it's natural to want connection, closeness, and shared experience. But sometimes this desire grows into something else, something quieter, subtler, and harder to notice. It becomes emotional merging, where the line between self and other begins to blur, and your inner world starts to reorganize around someone else's needs, moods, or expectations. Not out of malice, not even out of fear, but out of the longing to belong. Emotional merging isn't always dramatic. It can look like adapting too quickly, apologizing reflexively, reaching for their emotions before understanding your own. It can feel like you're being empathetic, like you're just being supportive or a good partner. But beneath the surface, your center of gravity starts to shift. You stop asking what you think and start anticipating what they want to hear. One reason this happens is because the brain is wired to seek safety in connection. From early childhood, we learn that closeness can mean survival. And so, when we sense tension or distance in a relationship, our nervous system may react by shrinking our sense of self, making us more agreeable, more compliant, more focused on maintaining harmony. The cost, however, is subtle self-abandonment. You might not even realize it's happening because it feels like love. But love without boundaries isn't intimacy, it's fusion. And fusion erases nuance. It can lead to a relationship where one person's discomfort automatically becomes yours, where you feel responsible for managing their reactions, where you lose access to your own thoughts, not because they were taken from you, but because you stopped checking in with yourself. This isn't just about romantic relationships. It happens in families, friendships, even in professional settings. Any relationship where the emotional balance tips too far in one direction can create this dynamic. And over time, it becomes a habit, a way of moving through the world that feels selfless, but actually leaves little room for authenticity. The consequences aren't always immediate. You may feel useful, even appreciated. But slowly, disconnection grows. Not from the other person, from yourself. You begin to lose the ability to distinguish between what you truly want and what you've merely absorbed. You might notice vague anxiety, chronic indecision, or a sense of being emotionally crowded, even when no one is pressuring you. To untangle from emotional merging, the first step is awareness. Start by noticing when your attention immediately shifts to someone else's reaction.
Ask yourself, what do I feel right now? What do I actually think? It sounds simple, but if you've spent years being attuned to others, these questions can feel unfamiliar, even selfish. They're not. They're foundational. Next comes differentiation. This doesn't mean emotional distance, it means emotional clarity. Being able to stay close without collapsing into the other person's emotional reality. Being able to care without carrying. Being able to say, I see how you feel, and I also know what's true for me. This requires practice, especially if your default has been over-adapting. It helps to build routines that reconnect you to yourself: journaling, silence, creative expression, solo walks. It helps to name your emotions without filtering them through someone else's perspective. Over time, this creates internal space, a pause, a place where your identity can breathe. One of the most powerful shifts in healing from emotional merging is learning that love does not require emotional enmeshment. In fact, it flourishes when each person remains fully themselves. You don't have to shrink to be loved. You don't have to anticipate every need to be worthy. You don't have to merge to matter. The healthiest relationships are not those where boundaries dissolve, but those where they are respected and even celebrated, where difference is not a threat but a source of learning, where emotional autonomy coexists with connection. Because when we no longer replaces me, something more honest takes its place. Partnership built not on fusion, but on choice. A relationship where both voices can speak, both needs can matter, and both selves can grow without disappearing. Number 23. The performance of vulnerability. In today's world, vulnerability is often praised as a virtue. We are told that opening up is courageous, that sharing our pain fosters intimacy, and that true connection comes from emotional transparency. And while that can be true, vulnerability, like anything, can also be used strategically. It can be shaped, timed, and even rehearsed. Not always consciously, but often with the quiet hope of being seen in a particular light. This is what we might call the performance of vulnerability. It doesn't mean the emotions aren't real. It means the way they're presented has been filtered, sometimes to control the response, sometimes to gain approval, and sometimes because the raw version feels too dangerous to share. You reveal just enough to appear open, but not so much that it risks rejection. You share your wounds, but in a way that feels polished, manageable, acceptable. In this form, vulnerability becomes a social currency. It's used to disarm criticism, to build trust quickly, or to signal emotional intelligence. And it often works. People respond to what seems honest. But over time, a strange thing can happen. The performance starts to replace the real thing. You become skilled at looking vulnerable without actually being exposed. This is especially common in environments where authenticity is rewarded: therapy, creative communities, online spaces. The performance of pain can feel like the price of admission. If you can tell your story with the right mix of gravity and insight, you gain a kind of credibility. But if you stay too guarded, you're seen as distant or untrustworthy. The danger here isn't that vulnerability is bad, it's that we confuse visibility with depth, that we believe being seen is the same as being known, that we start crafting emotional disclosures not to connect but to be admired. And when that happens, something subtle gets lost: the messiness, the hesitation, the awkward, unfiltered truth that real vulnerability requires. This isn't just about others, it's about you too. When you perform vulnerability often enough, it can become harder to locate your authentic emotions. You may start telling your story in a way that no longer feels true. You might wonder, is this still my experience, or just a version of it I've learned to narrate? That question can be disorienting, but it's also the beginning of returning to yourself. So how do you tell the difference between real vulnerability? Pay attention to your motivation. Are you sharing to connect or to manage perception? Are you speaking from the center of your experience or from a version of yourself that feels more acceptable? Do you feel relieved afterward or slightly more disconnected? Real vulnerability often feels awkward, unscripted. It doesn't always come with tidy insights or clear narratives. Sometimes it just sounds like, "I don't know," or "this still hurts," or "I'm afraid you'll think less of me." It's not about dramatizing your emotions, it's about allowing them to be witnessed in their natural, unpolished state. This doesn't mean you owe your vulnerability to everyone. Boundaries matter, discretion matters. But when you choose to share, let it come from a place of internal alignment, not performance. Let it be grounded in presence, not strategy. Because real connection doesn't require theatricality. It asks for honesty, even when that honesty is quiet, even when it's incomplete. One of the deepest ironies is that real vulnerability often happens in small moments. A pause before answering, a crack in the voice, a hesitation before finishing the sentence. These are not performances. They're signs of something alive moving through you. They don't ask to be admired. They ask to be felt. And in that space, beneath the performance, beneath the practiced version of pain, there is something deeply human. A desire to be met, not managed. To be understood, not evaluated. To be held, even briefly, without having to prove your worth. That's what vulnerability makes possible. Not applause, but presence.
Number 24. How you confuse validation with connection. We all want to feel seen, to know that our emotions matter, that our presence registers in someone else's mind as something meaningful. This desire isn't inherently flawed. It's part of what makes us human. But somewhere along the way, many of us begin to substitute connection with something that looks very similar, yet functions quite differently: validation. Validation is the feeling you get when someone reflects back approval, agreement, or affirmation. It tells you, "Yes, you're right to feel that way," or "I see what you're going through, and I understand." It's comforting, grounding. It calms the nervous system, even if just for a moment. And in a world that often ignores or minimizes inner experience, validation can feel like oxygen. But there's a trap hidden inside this comfort. When validation becomes the goal rather than the byproduct of authentic connection, it changes how you relate to others. You may begin to tailor what you say in order to receive the response you hope for. You may start measuring the quality of your relationships by how often people affirm you. And over time, you may lose touch with what it means to be in genuine connection, messy, mutual, and not always validating. Connection is different. It doesn't always mirror your emotions. It doesn't always agree. It might challenge you, confuse you, even frustrate you. But it stays present. It makes room for contradiction. It allows both people to exist in their full complexity. Connection says, "I don't fully get it, but I'm here anyway." Validation, on the other hand, often says, "I get it, whether it truly does or not." This distinction becomes especially important in moments of vulnerability. When you share something difficult, are you hoping to be understood or to be affirmed? Are you open to another person's perspective or only to reflections that soothe? These questions matter because they reveal the terms of engagement. Are you entering a conversation or presenting a monologue that waits for applause? Many of us learned early on that certain emotions or behaviors earned more approval than others. You might have received more warmth when you were agreeable, more attention when you were in pain, more praise when you were self-sacrificing. These patterns teach you to seek validation as a survival tool, and they blur the line between being yourself and performing what others will reward. Over time, you may begin to feel lonely, even in relationships that seem close. Because if connection depends on being validated, then any deviation feels like a rupture. You hesitate to share the parts of yourself that might not be met with instant affirmation. You withhold confusion, frustration, doubt, because these might invite disagreement or worse, silence. And so even as you're surrounded by people who agree with you, you might feel profoundly unknown. Reclaiming the distinction between validation and connection means learning to tolerate discomfort, to stay present when someone doesn't respond how you hoped, to resist the urge to explain yourself until you receive the exact reaction you're craving. It means allowing space for others to have their own emotional truth, even when it doesn't align with yours. This doesn't mean you shouldn't seek understanding, but it asks you to expand your definition of what connection looks like. It's not just being mirrored, it's being engaged. It's not just hearing, "You're right," it's feeling, "I'm here with you," even when there's no neat conclusion. Ironically, the more you release your grip on validation, the more authentic your relationships become. You stop chasing the perfect reaction. You stop crafting your words to avoid discomfort. And in doing so, you make room for something deeper, a sense of presence that isn't dependent on being right, agreed with, or applauded. That's the kind of connection that endures, not because it always feels good, but because it's real. Number 25. Why you repeat the same conflicts with different people. At some point, you might pause and ask yourself a question that feels almost absurd in its clarity. Why does this keep happening to me? You're in a disagreement, a moment of emotional tension, or maybe the slow drift of another fractured relationship, and the pattern feels eerily familiar. Different person, different context, but the same emotional script playing out again. These repeated conflicts aren't just coincidences or accidents of bad luck. They are often the surface expression of something deeper. Internal dynamics, beliefs, and relational templates that you carry unconsciously. When left unexamined, these inner structures begin to shape your interactions, priming you to recreate the same emotional atmosphere across different relationships. At the heart of this repetition is your emotional memory. Your brain doesn't just remember facts or events. It remembers how certain situations felt, especially the unresolved ones. When a feeling from the past hasn't been fully processed, your nervous system remains on alert for anything that resembles it. Not to avoid it, but often, paradoxically, to resolve it. You may unconsciously seek out people or situations that mirror old wounds, not because you enjoy the pain, but because a part of you hopes to finally get it right. If a parent ignored your needs, you might find yourself drawn to partners who seem emotionally unavailable. If criticism was common in childhood, you may feel strangely at home with someone who is hard to please. These dynamics aren't chosen deliberately. They emerge from the emotional maps your mind constructed early on. The result is a looping pattern. You meet someone new. Things feel fresh, different. But as the relationship deepens, familiar themes begin to surface. Feeling unseen, unheard, disrespected, controlled. Your responses also begin to follow a script. Maybe you retreat. Maybe you over-explain. Maybe you lash out. But underneath the behavior is a familiar emotion: fear, shame, inadequacy, rage. What's most disorienting is how these patterns seem to find you, even when you try to avoid them. You might change your environment, leave a job, and a relationship, only to find yourself in the same emotional cycle weeks or months later. This can lead to cynicism or self-blame, the feeling that something must be fundamentally wrong with you. But the issue isn't that you're broken, it's that your nervous system is loyal to the past. Breaking the cycle starts with recognition, not just of the pattern, but of the story you tell yourself about why it's happening. Do you always cast yourself as the victim, the fixer, the one who cares too much, the one who gets pushed away?
These roles may feel familiar and even comfortable in their predictability, but they also keep you stuck. They simplify complex dynamics into neat narratives that prevent deeper inquiry. Next comes curiosity. What need is being expressed underneath the conflict? Is it a need for safety, for respect, for closeness, for control? Can you separate the current moment from the emotional residue of the past? Can you respond to what's actually happening rather than reacting from old scripts? Often, repeated conflicts thrive in relationships where implicit expectations go unspoken. You might expect someone to read your mind, anticipate your needs, or avoid your triggers without ever communicating them. When they inevitably fail, it confirms your belief that no one truly understands you. But what's actually missing isn't understanding, it's clarity. You can't rewrite old dynamics without conscious intervention. That means developing the courage to name your patterns, to pause in the heat of a reaction and ask, is this about now or is this about then? It means recognizing that growth often feels like loss, of control, of certainty, of the familiar version of yourself who knew how to survive. These changes won't guarantee conflict-free relationships, but they will allow you to enter conflict differently, with more awareness, with more agency, with less fear that history is doomed to repeat itself. Because once you see the pattern, you're no longer just living it. You're beginning to unlearn it.
Number 26. Micro self-betrayals in relationships. When most people think of betrayal, they imagine something dramatic, a broken promise, a hidden affair, a lie that upends trust. But there's a quieter form of betrayal that happens not all at once, but in small, almost imperceptible moments. It doesn't come from others, it comes from you. And it doesn't usually feel like betrayal at all. It feels like compromise, like keeping the peace, like being mature or reasonable. These are micro self-betrayals, and over time, they fracture your sense of self from the inside out. You commit a micro self-betrayal when you smile while feeling hurt, say yes while meaning no, agree to something you know is wrong for you, or stay silent to avoid discomfort. It might look like a simple gesture, like letting your partner choose the restaurant even when you're craving something else. Or it might feel more loaded, like staying in a conversation that feels emotionally unsafe, just so you're not seen as difficult. Individually, these choices might seem inconsequential, but they accumulate. Each time you ignore your gut feeling, suppress your opinion, or swallow your discomfort, you teach yourself that your needs are negotiable, that your comfort is optional, that harmony matters more than honesty. You start to lose track of what you want, not because you don't care, but because you've practiced disconnection for so long that authenticity feels unfamiliar. This pattern often begins early. If your environment rewarded compliance over expression, you likely learned that approval is conditional. Maybe speaking your mind triggered rejection. Maybe advocating for your needs led to conflict. So you adapted. You became agreeable, flexible, easygoing, sometimes so much so that you forgot where your own edges are. In adult relationships, this learned self-suppression shows up subtly but consistently. You hesitate to express boundaries because you don't want to seem selfish. You mirror others' preferences and priorities, telling yourself you're being supportive. You make space for their emotions but keep yours tightly managed. Over time, this creates an internal tension. Your outer presentation says, "I'm fine," but your inner world is quietly eroding. This erosion leads to resentment, not because others are necessarily mistreating you, but because you've silenced the part of yourself that needed something different. Resentment becomes the residue of unmet needs, unspoken desires, and unacknowledged pain. And the longer you wait to address it, the harder it becomes to locate its origin. You just feel tired, frustrated, disconnected, like something is missing, but you can't quite name what. Breaking this pattern doesn't require a dramatic confrontation. It begins with noticing. When do you say yes out of fear rather than desire? When do you shrink to maintain closeness? When do you sense yourself disappearing in the name of harmony? These are not moments of strength. They are clues, indicators that your integrity is quietly leaking. Start with small repairs. Say what you really think, even if your voice shakes. Practice declining things you don't want to do. Allow someone to see your discomfort without immediately softening it for their sake. These may seem like tiny acts, but they're foundational. They begin to rebuild the muscle of self-trust, which is often the first casualty in a pattern of self-betrayal. Importantly, reclaiming your voice doesn't mean becoming rigid or combative. It means becoming honest, with yourself first and foremost, and then with others. It means recognizing that real connection isn't built through self-erasure. It's built through authenticity, even when it invites friction. The people who truly care about you may not always understand your shift right away. They've gotten used to the version of you who accommodated, adapted, absorbed. But if a relationship only survives because you keep giving up parts of yourself, it's not a relationship, it's a performance. And you deserve more than that. Because a healthy relationship doesn't require the suppression of your truth. It welcomes it.
Number 27. Passive agreements that accumulate over time. Not all agreements are spoken. Many are built in silence, through nods, smiles, or the simple decision not to push back. These are passive agreements, and they can shape the architecture of your relationships in profound ways. You may not remember when they started, but you live inside them every day. They determine what gets discussed and what doesn't, what behaviors go unchecked, and what patterns become normalized. And like sediment slowly collecting on the floor of a river, these agreements accumulate, until one day you realize you're living in a version of life you never actively chose. A passive agreement is what happens when you let something slide, not once, but repeatedly. A friend interrupts you mid-sentence, and you don't say anything. A partner makes decisions without consulting you, and you convince yourself it's not worth the discussion. A family member jokes at your expense, and you smile along. Over time, these moments become templates. Not because you agreed explicitly, but because your silence filled in the blanks. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures. We find safety in predictability. And in relationships, that often means falling into implicit roles and routines. You become the one who always compromises, the one who forgives quickly, the one who doesn't make a fuss. These roles may be functional, but they are not always authentic. They help keep the peace, yes, but often at the cost of your own clarity. The danger of passive agreements is that they can go unexamined for years. You begin to feel irritated, exhausted, or distant in your relationships, but you can't quite articulate why. You've never had a big fight. Nothing dramatic has happened. But somewhere along the way, you stopped feeling fully present, because you were too busy maintaining a version of the relationship that no longer reflects who you are. These agreements are hard to confront because they're not written down. There's no clear contract to point to, no obvious rule to challenge. They exist in gestures, habits, and unspoken understandings, which means that to change them, you first have to acknowledge that they exist, that you played a role in sustaining them, that your silence, even if it was protective, has now become constraining. Change begins with inquiry. Ask yourself, what have I agreed to through my silence? Where have I taught others to expect something from me that I no longer want to give? What rhythms in my relationships feel like obligations rather than choices? These questions aren't comfortable, but they're clarifying. They begin to peel back the layers of unconscious participation. From there, the process becomes one of gentle disruption. You start speaking up where you once stayed quiet. You express preferences you used to suppress. You question dynamics that once felt fixed. And slowly, the people around you learn that the terms have changed. Some will welcome this. Others may resist.
Because your growth, especially if it disrupts the status quo, can be perceived as a threat to those who benefited from the old agreements. But you're not responsible for preserving a version of yourself that no longer feels true. You are responsible for noticing when your life has become a performance of compliance rather than an expression of truth, and for taking steps, however small, to change that. Because over time, the cost of these passive agreements isn't just discomfort. It's disconnection from yourself, from others, from the kind of relationships that are built not on assumption, but on honesty. And the good news is, you don't need permission to rewrite the script. You only need the willingness to speak one truth at a time.
Number 28. Why closeness sometimes feels threatening. Closeness is often romanticized as the highest form of connection, intimacy, vulnerability, shared truth. But for many people, it brings an unexpected undercurrent of discomfort. Not because they don't care, not because they want to push others away, but because closeness demands exposure, and exposure feels dangerous when you've spent a lifetime managing what others are allowed to see. Emotional closeness means allowing someone else to witness the parts of you that aren't curated, the confusion, the doubt, the contradictions. And if your early experiences taught you that visibility leads to criticism, abandonment, or control, then even the safest closeness can feel risky. Your nervous system may interpret openness as a kind of trespass, not because the other person is doing anything wrong, but because your internal wiring confuses proximity with vulnerability, and vulnerability with danger. This discomfort doesn't always show up as fear. Sometimes it looks like sarcasm or withdrawal. Sometimes it's a sudden wave of irritation towards someone you genuinely like. Sometimes you find yourself longing for closeness and then pulling away the moment it's offered. These patterns aren't signs that something's wrong with you. They're protective reflexes, learned responses to a world that once made emotional exposure feel unsafe. It's also why some people feel most at ease in relationships where emotional distance is the norm, where everything stays light, casual, unspoken, where no one asks too many questions or expects too much depth. These dynamics feel predictable, and predictability feels safe, even when it's also lonely. Paradoxically, closeness can feel threatening not because it exposes your weaknesses, but because it threatens your strategies. If you've built your identity around being self-sufficient, invulnerable, or always in control, then genuine intimacy can feel like a challenge to that identity. It asks you to let go, to be changed in the presence of another, and that requires a kind of courage that doesn't always feel natural. There's also a hidden grief in allowing closeness, because once you let someone in, their absence matters, their opinion matters, their inconsistency matters. And that kind of emotional investment can feel overwhelming, especially if you've spent years minimizing your own needs just to keep life manageable. To navigate this, it's helpful to shift the narrative. Instead of seeing closeness as a test of loyalty or a threat to your autonomy, see it as a skill, one that can be learned, unlearned, and relearned over time. Closeness doesn't require perfection. It requires presence. It doesn't ask you to reveal everything all at once. It asks you to notice when you're retreating and to ask yourself why. One powerful step is to notice your internal state when someone moves toward you emotionally. Do you tense up? Do you mentally prepare a response? Do you feel the urge to change the subject? These micro-responses are data. They tell you where the fear lives, where the guardrails are strongest. And if you're willing to sit with that discomfort just long enough to stay present, you begin to teach yourself a new kind of safety. Communicating your edges is also essential. Not everyone knows what feels too fast, too soon, too deep. Saying, "I need a little time to think about that," or "That's hard for me to talk about, but I'm trying," can build trust without sacrificing your pace. Closeness isn't a race to transparency.
It's a process of mutual pacing, where each step forward is grounded in consent. Over time, what once felt threatening begins to feel nourishing, not because the fear disappears entirely, but because you've built enough internal scaffolding to hold it. You've learned that not all exposure leads to harm, that some people will meet your openness with care, that your needs don't make you weak, they make you human. And ultimately, closeness isn't just about being seen. It's about being seen without losing yourself. It's about choosing connection, not out of fear or habit, but out of alignment. Because when closeness no longer feels like a risk, it begins to feel home.
Number 29. The helper identity trap. Helping others is often celebrated as a sign of empathy, selflessness, and emotional intelligence. And in many ways, it is. But when the act of helping becomes central to your identity, when your sense of worth is tied to being useful, needed, or indispensable, you may find yourself caught in a subtle psychological trap. One where giving becomes compulsive, boundaries become blurry, and your own needs are sidelined in the name of service. This is the helper identity trap, the belief that your value comes primarily from what you can do for others. It's not inherently toxic. In fact, many people who fall into this pattern are kind, attentive, and emotionally attuned. But the trap lies in the hidden motivations. Often, the impulse to help isn't just about compassion. It's about securing a sense of safety, belonging, or approval through utility. From a young age, you might have learned that being helpful made you more likable, less of a burden, or more acceptable in the eyes of authority figures. Maybe offering support diffused conflict. Maybe fixing problems earned praise. Maybe being the emotional anchor in your family gave you a sense of control in an unpredictable environment. Over time, these adaptive behaviors can solidify into identity, the fixer, the caretaker, the one who always shows up. The problem is that when this identity becomes too rigid, it leaves little space for reciprocity. You may find it uncomfortable to receive help. You may feel guilty for having needs, or ashamed when you can't solve someone else's problem. You may even feel invisible unless you're actively providing something. And that can lead to chronic burnout, emotional resentment, and a deep sense of loneliness that's hard to articulate, because on the surface, you're always giving. Another danger of the helper identity is enmeshment. When your boundaries are unclear, you can start to absorb other people's emotions, responsibilities, or pain as if they were your own. This emotional over-identification blurs the line between care and control. You might offer unsolicited advice, feel anxious when others make choices you disagree with, or unconsciously expect others to depend on you in ways that validate your role. Over time, helping becomes less about support and more about preservation of your identity, your place in the dynamic, your sense of self. And the more this role is reinforced, the harder it becomes to imagine who you are outside of it. Who are you when no one needs you? Who are you when you're not fixing anything? Those questions can be disorienting, but they're also essential. Breaking the helper identity trap doesn't mean abandoning your compassion. It means expanding your identity to include more than your usefulness. It means recognizing that your needs matter, even when no one else is asking. It means trusting that people will still value you when you're not actively performing support. A practical starting point is to pause before offering help. Ask yourself, am I doing this because they need it or because I need to be needed? It's a subtle distinction, but it matters. You might also experiment with receiving, allowing others to support you, even in small ways, and noticing the discomfort that arises without trying to fix it. These moments challenge the belief that you must earn connection through labor. It's also helpful to notice the stories you tell yourself when you're not helping. Do you feel useless, selfish, disconnected? These narratives often originate from old emotional contracts, unspoken agreements you made with yourself or your environment about what made you valuable, and those contracts can be rewritten. Boundaries are another key element. They don't have to be harsh or defensive. They're simply acknowledgments of where you end and someone else begins. They protect your energy, clarify your role, and ensure that your giving is intentional rather than automatic. Saying no, stepping back, or redirecting someone to their own agency isn't unkind. It's respectful to both of you. Ultimately, moving beyond the helper identity means learning to relate to others without losing yourself. It means showing up because you want to, not because you have to. It means building relationships based on mutual presence, not transactional roles. And perhaps most importantly, it means discovering that you are still worthy, still whole, even when you're not fixing anything at all.
Number 30. The fear of being misunderstood. For many people, few experiences are as quietly distressing as being misunderstood. It's not always dramatic. It doesn't require shouting matches or open conflict. Often, it's subtle. A pause in the conversation, a blank look, a well-intentioned but incorrect interpretation of your thoughts. And in that moment, something inside contracts. Not because the facts are wrong, but because the feeling is, they didn't really get me. This fear can run deeper than we realize. On the surface, it might appear as perfectionism in communication, a tendency to over-explain, or frustration when others don't see things the way they are. But underneath, it's often a fear of emotional isolation, the sense that if someone doesn't understand you, then your experience isn't real, or valid, or safe to express. Part of this comes from how our minds link understanding to safety. From childhood, our brains associate being accurately mirrored, emotionally and cognitively, with regulation and security. When someone reflects back our feelings, when they say, "I get it," and actually do, it activates a powerful sense of resonance. We're not alone. We exist. We make sense. So when that doesn't happen, especially consistently, it can leave a lasting imprint. One that says, if people don't understand me, I must not be expressing myself well. I must not be clear. I must not be enough. Over time, this can create a loop, a hyper-awareness of how you're perceived, a compulsion to correct or clarify even minor misreadings, and a quiet sense of panic when your words land differently than intended. You may rehearse conversations in your mind. You may avoid speaking until you found the exact right phrasing. You may even withdraw from dialogue altogether, convinced it's better not to try than to risk being misread. And in doing so, you may start shrinking your presence to fit the narrowest margin of misinterpretation. You hold back opinions that could be controversial. You soften the edges of your personality. You preface everything with disclaimers. And yet, despite all of that effort, the fear remains, because no amount of control can guarantee perfect understanding. Here's the truth. Being misunderstood is not just likely, it's inevitable. Language is a bridge, not a mirror. People hear through filters of their own experiences, beliefs, defenses. No matter how precisely you speak, your words will always land inside someone else's cognitive world, not your own. And while clarity matters, your safety can't depend on someone else's comprehension. Learning to live with the fear of being misunderstood doesn't mean becoming careless or vague. It means shifting the goal. Instead of aiming to be perfectly understood, you aim to be honestly expressed. You focus on accuracy from your end, not control over theirs. You give people the chance to meet you where you are, while releasing the illusion that you can edit yourself into perfect resonance. This shift is liberating. It opens the door to deeper conversations, to authenticity, to vulnerability that's not contingent on approval. It allows you to say, "This is what I meant," or "Let me try again," or even, "I don't think I can explain this in a way that will land, and that's okay." And in that space, you stop performing clarity and start practicing presence. A practical exercise is to notice when you're explaining something, especially something personal or emotionally complex, and ask yourself, am I trying to connect or am I trying to control? The answer is often both, but the second motive can become dominant if left unchecked. If you notice yourself spiraling into overclarification, it might be a cue to pause, to breathe, to trust that even if this moment doesn't land, others might. Another useful practice is to tolerate the silence after you speak. Many people rush to fill that silence with follow-ups, elaborations, or self-corrections. But silence is often the space in which the other person's understanding starts to form. Giving it time allows them to catch up, ask questions, or reflect back in their own way. And finally, remind yourself that your clarity is not proof of your worth. You don't have to be perfectly articulate to be valid. Your inner experience matters, even when it's messy, fragmented, or misunderstood. Especially then, because that's when you're being real, not rehearsed. The fear of being misunderstood is human, but so is the courage to keep speaking anyway.
Number 31. Self-gaslighting and the erosion of intuition. Self-gaslighting is one of the most insidious psychological patterns we can fall into, not because someone else manipulates our perception of reality, but because we learn to do it to ourselves. It's not always obvious. It doesn't sound like, "You're crazy." It sounds more like, "Maybe I'm overreacting. I must be remembering it wrong. I'm probably just being too sensitive." At first, it seems like humility, self-awareness, or emotional maturity. But when these thoughts become habitual, they can slowly undermine one of your most essential tools, your intuition. Intuition isn't magic. It's not about psychic abilities or mysterious forces. It's your nervous system gathering data, sometimes faster than your conscious mind can process, and giving you a signal, a gut feeling, a subtle pull, a quiet discomfort. It's the pattern recognition engine of your brain saying, "This feels familiar, this doesn't align," or "something is off here." And when trusted, it can act like an early warning system for emotional misalignment, relational danger, or self-betrayal. But when self-gaslighting enters the equation, that signal gets muted. You start second-guessing your instincts. You override discomfort with rationalizations. You explain away emotional pain as irrational or inconvenient. Over time, you become less fluent in your own internal language, and the cost isn't just confusion, it's disconnection from yourself. This disconnection often begins early. For many people, childhood was a place where emotional reality wasn't mirrored accurately. Maybe when you cried, you were told to stop being dramatic. Maybe when you were hurt, the response was, "You're fine." Or maybe your emotional responses were consistently questioned, criticized, or ignored. In those moments, you weren't just learning how to manage your feelings, you were learning which feelings were acceptable, which ones to suppress, which parts of your truth had to be edited to maintain connection. That's the foundation of self-gaslighting, the belief that your internal world isn't reliable. So, as an adult, when your intuition tells you that something's wrong in a conversation, in a relationship, or in a decision, you immediately question it. You ask yourself if you're projecting. You assume the best of others while doubting the worst in yourself. You become excellent at understanding other people's perspectives, but terrible at honoring your own. This pattern becomes particularly harmful in relationships. You might stay in dynamics that feel draining because you convince yourself the problem is your expectations. You might avoid expressing discomfort because you don't want to seem controlling. You might downplay red flags, minimize your needs, or pretend you're okay just to avoid the possibility that your perception could be flawed. And even when your intuition whispers, you silence it with internal debates. Reclaiming your intuition starts with identifying the voice of self-doubt. Pay attention to your self-talk when you feel emotionally activated. Do you immediately search for logical reasons to dismiss your feelings? Do you compare your reactions to what you think others would do? Do you shame yourself for having needs? These habits don't make you weak. They reveal the adaptive strategies you learned to survive a world that didn't always validate your inner reality. The next step is to shift your internal response. When your intuition surfaces, even subtly, pause. Don't rush to explain it away. Ask yourself, What would I tell a close friend if they felt this? Often, we extend more compassion and credibility to others than to ourselves. By treating your own discomfort with that same level of respect, you begin to rebuild trust with your inner world. Also, distinguish between feeling uncertain and being wrong. Many people conflate the two. But intuition doesn't always arrive with clarity or confidence. Sometimes it's just a quiet sense of misalignment. Trusting that feeling doesn't mean acting impulsively. It means not dismissing it prematurely. It means allowing space for reflection. It means giving your experience the benefit of the doubt. Another tool is keeping a record. Not a journal of facts, but a log of gut feelings. When something feels off, note it. Later, observe if that feeling had a basis. This retrospective practice helps you calibrate. It reveals patterns. Over time, you begin to see that your body knew even when your mind didn't. Finally, reclaiming your intuition is not about being always right. It's about being consistently honest with yourself. It's about creating an internal environment where feelings don't need to be justified to be valid, where your reality isn't automatically suspect, where your perception matters. Self-gaslighting fractures the bridge between emotion and awareness. Rebuilding it means letting go of the habit of self-interrogation and returning to a quieter kind of knowing, the kind that doesn't need approval to be trusted.
Number 32. The voice that doubts everything new. There's a voice inside your head that doesn't like change. It doesn't yell, it questions. It speaks in half-formed thoughts and subtle hesitations. Are you sure? It says. What if it doesn't work? What if you're not ready? It's not trying to sabotage you. In fact, it believes it's protecting you. But that quiet doubt, disguised as caution, can become the invisible wall between where you are and where you want to be. This voice isn't a flaw. It's the product of millions of years of evolution. Your brain is designed to prioritize familiarity over novelty, stability over risk. To the nervous system, anything unknown could be dangerous. And in the absence of guarantees, the safest move is often no move at all. You might notice this voice the moment inspiration strikes. You have an idea, a desire, a spark of motivation. For a brief moment, it feels real, possible, even exciting. Then the voice appears. It pokes holes in the vision. It replays past failures. It conjures unlikely outcomes. Not because it wants you to fail, but because it wants you to stay safe. This inner doubt becomes particularly loud when you're close to acting on something meaningful, starting a new project, setting a boundary, changing a habit, speaking up. The voice reminds you of what could go wrong, not out of cruelty, but from habit. It equates risk with danger, discomfort with error. And it's not just trying to prevent external failure, it's trying to prevent internal disappointment. But when that voice becomes the dominant narrator of your life, new experiences begin to feel like threats. You hesitate to apply for a new job because maybe you're not qualified. You pull back from expressing your opinion because you might be wrong. You resist exploring unfamiliar ideas because what if they lead you astray? The result is a life filtered through a lens of suspicion, not of others, but of yourself. The challenge isn't to silence this voice, it's to understand it. That inner doubt often echoes old conditioning. Maybe you were raised in an environment where mistakes were punished harshly. Maybe you were told that being careful was the same as being smart. Maybe you learned that certainty was a prerequisite for action. In those contexts, doubt became adaptive. It was safer to overthink than to risk judgment. To shift this pattern, you have to redefine what doubt means. Doubt isn't always a signal to stop. Sometimes it's a sign that you're stretching, that you're encountering something new, that your internal system is recalibrating to a version of yourself that doesn't yet have evidence, and that's okay. Start by reframing your relationship to uncertainty. Instead of asking, "What if this goes wrong?" ask, "What would I learn even if it did?" This doesn't mean becoming reckless. It means honoring growth over guarantees.
It means allowing discomfort to be part of the process, not a reason to abort it. Another strategy is to shift the question from "Am I ready?" to "Am I willing?" Readiness often implies a state of perfection, no fear, no doubt, no risk. But willingness acknowledges that action and uncertainty can coexist. You don't have to be sure to begin, you just have to begin. It also helps to externalize the voice. When you notice it arise, don't automatically identify with it. Instead, treat it like a cautious advisor. Listen, consider, and then make your own decision. This separation creates space. It allows you to move from reaction to reflection, from default to choice. Build a habit of experimenting with low-stakes discomfort. Try something small that feels slightly outside your norm. Observe the voice of doubt, but act anyway. Over time, you'll gather data, not just about what works, but about your capacity to act in the presence of uncertainty. And most importantly, recognize that doubt doesn't mean something is wrong. It often means something matters. If the voice wasn't there, it might mean you weren't challenging anything significant. Its presence isn't an alarm. It's a signal that you're approaching a threshold. That's the paradox of inner doubt. The louder it becomes, the more meaningful the decision likely is. And while the voice may never fully disappear, your relationship with it can change. You can hear it without obeying it, acknowledge it without internalizing it, respect it without surrendering to it. Progress doesn't always come from silencing your fears. Sometimes it comes from walking forward while they speak. Number 33. Sabotaging progress to stay in control. Self-sabotage often looks like failure from the outside. Missed deadlines, abandoned projects, broken routines. But internally, it's something else entirely. It's not laziness, it's not weakness, it's a strategy. A way to maintain control when life begins to feel uncertain, fast-moving, or unfamiliar. Sometimes, the only way the mind knows how to stay safe is to slow things down, even if that means disrupting your own growth. Progress is destabilizing. It brings change, and with change comes a sense of unpredictability. A new habit, for example, might seem positive on the surface, waking up early, exercising, communicating more clearly. But underneath, it introduces new expectations. What happens if you can't keep it up? What if others start relying on the new version of you? What if success leads to pressure, visibility, or even loss? So, without realizing it, your mind begins to pump the brakes. You sleep in, you cancel plans, you miss one day, then another. But it's not a coincidence. It's a pattern, a way to retreat to the familiar, because the familiar, even when it's uncomfortable, feels more manageable than the unknown. Sometimes, sabotage shows up through perfectionism. You overplan, overthink, or set the bar so high that failure is inevitable. That way, when you fall short, it's not because you weren't capable, it's because the goal was unrealistic. This protects your sense of identity, even while it disrupts your progress. Other times, sabotage looks like chronic starting and stopping. You commit, then you pull back. You announce intentions, but struggle with follow-through. This inconsistency creates a kind of insulation. If you never fully try, you never fully fail. And if you stay in motion without completion, you can tell yourself you're doing the work, without facing the vulnerability of finishing. There's also a relational version of this. When things are going well, more intimacy, more visibility, more trust, you might create conflict, distance yourself, or withdraw. Not because you don't want closeness, but because you don't trust what comes with it. Maybe you've been let down before. Maybe progress in relationships has historically meant vulnerability, and vulnerability has meant pain. The root of all this is often a desire for safety. When growth feels like a threat, either to your identity, your relationships, or your perceived stability, the nervous system reacts. And sabotage becomes a way to stay anchored in the known. It's a defense mechanism, not a character flaw. To change this pattern, you have to create a different relationship with control. Control doesn't have to mean stopping the flow of life. It can also mean steering it, guiding it gently, taking ownership not by pressing pause, but by learning how to stay present in motion. Start small. Track your sabotage patterns without judgment. Where do you pull back when things begin to work? When do you start self-criticizing just as you're gaining momentum? What do you tell yourself when you delay, avoid, or distract? These patterns are clues. They're not the enemy, they're a map. Then experiment with reframing discomfort. Instead of interpreting nervousness as a red flag, try seeing it as a green light, a sign that you're moving into new territory, a place where your growth edge lives. The goal isn't to be fearless, it's to recognize fear as part of the expansion process, not a command to retreat. Another approach is to separate identity from performance. You are not your routines. You are not your outcomes. When you internalize this, mistakes lose their sting. They become data, not definitions. And progress stops feeling like a gamble. It becomes an unfolding. Finally, create rituals of stabilization that help you feel grounded even as you stretch. These might be daily reflections, time in nature, conversations with someone who understands your journey. The more supported your nervous system feels, the less it will need to slam on the brakes every time something new begins. Self-sabotage isn't about fear of failure, really. It's about fear of the unknown version of you that success might reveal. But that version already exists, just outside the range of your current patterns. And each time you resist the pull to regress, you make space for it to emerge.
Number 34. When growth feels like disloyalty to the past. Personal growth is often framed as liberation, as a journey towards something better. But what's rarely discussed is the subtle guilt that can accompany it. The feeling that, by becoming someone new, you're betraying who you used to be, or the people who knew you then. Growth, in this sense, isn't just about change. It's about navigating the emotional weight of leaving behind identities, relationships, and worldviews that once defined you. This guilt isn't always obvious. Sometimes it shows up as hesitation. You hesitate to speak differently, to dress differently, to think differently, because someone from your past might not recognize you anymore. Or worse, they might feel rejected by the person you're becoming. That fear of being too different can silently discourage transformation. The tension often arises when your new beliefs contradict the old ones that once connected you to others. Maybe you no longer believe in the same values, no longer participate in the same behaviors, no longer laugh at the same jokes. And while these shifts may be signs of evolution, they also carry consequences. The possibility of alienation, of being seen as disloyal or fake, even when you're just being honest. For many, the sense of disloyalty is tied to community. We're social beings wired for belonging, and part of belonging is shared identity. So when you change, it can feel like you're stepping outside of the circle, voluntarily breaking an unspoken contract. The contract that says, we're this kind of person, we believe these kinds of things, we live this kind of life. Even family dynamics are affected. When you start to outgrow the roles you've always played, the peacekeeper, the underachiever, the dependent one, it disrupts the balance. Others may resist your growth, not out of malice, but out of fear. If you change, the whole system must recalibrate, and that's uncomfortable for everyone involved. This emotional complexity can lead to internal conflict. You want to grow, but you also want to remain loyal. You want to evolve, but you don't want to hurt anyone. So you split yourself in two, one version for the future you want, and one to protect the past you came from. That split is exhausting. It makes forward movement feel heavy, inconsistent, or even hollow. But the truth is, honoring your past doesn't mean staying there. Growth isn't a betrayal, it's a continuation. You're not rejecting who you were, you're expanding on it. You're carrying forward the lessons, the values, the strengths, and even the scars that made this growth possible.
There's a difference between abandonment and integration. One way to ease this transition is through intentional reflection. Instead of pushing your past away, invite it in. Ask yourself, what parts of me still serve a purpose? What parts were survival strategies that I can now release? What did I once believe that I now see differently, and why? This isn't about shame, it's about context. You're placing your story on a timeline, not erasing it. It also helps to acknowledge the grief. Growth often involves loss, the loss of certainty, of simplicity, of shared understanding. Grieving those losses creates space for acceptance. It allows you to thank the previous chapters of your life without needing to rewrite them. That kind of closure is quiet, personal, and powerful. If you find that others are struggling with your changes, it may be useful to communicate openly. Sometimes people just need to hear that your growth isn't a rejection of them. It's a realignment with yourself. And while not everyone will understand, those who value you beyond your role will adapt. Most importantly, give yourself permission. Permission to evolve, to outgrow, to surprise even yourself. Your life is not a museum exhibit frozen in time for the comfort of others. It's a dynamic process, a conversation between who you were, who you are, and who you're becoming. There is no betrayal in becoming more honest. There is no disloyalty in healing. You can carry your history without becoming hostage to it. And you can love where you came from without limiting where you're going.
Number 35. Invisible belief systems you've never questioned. Some of the most influential forces in your life are the ones you've never consciously examined. These aren't beliefs you chose after careful thought. They're frameworks you absorbed, quietly, unconsciously, and early, shaping how you interpret the world long before you had the language to describe them. They become the background noise of your mind, the hidden operating system behind your decisions, reactions, and values. These belief systems often masquerade as just the way things are. They feel like common sense, like realism, like maturity. But what they actually reflect is conditioning, often inherited from family, culture, religion, education, or media. Beliefs about success, failure, love, suffering, responsibility, freedom, even what it means to be a good person, are passed down not through formal teaching, but through repetition, silence, praise, punishment, and social reinforcement. You might believe, for instance, that your worth is tied to productivity, that rest is laziness, that conflict means disconnection, that emotions are weakness, that vulnerability is dangerous, that being needed is the same as being loved. You might not even realize you believe these things. They simply guide your behavior from behind the curtain, like an invisible script you didn't know you were following. What makes these beliefs so powerful is their invisibility. Because you rarely question what feels normal. You rarely challenge what everyone around you accepts. And the mind, once given a framework, tends to filter out anything that contradicts it. This is how whole lives can be shaped by beliefs that were never chosen, only inherited. The impact can be profound. An invisible belief can influence your career choices, your relationships, your coping strategies, your confidence, your creativity. It can keep you stuck in patterns that don't feel right, but that you can't quite explain. You'll say, "This is just who I am," without realizing you're describing a belief system, not a fixed identity. So how do you begin to see what's been invisible? One way is to notice emotional friction. Moments when your actions contradict your values. Moments when your decisions don't align with your goals. Moments when you feel trapped by a sense of should that doesn't make sense anymore. These are signs of inherited beliefs clashing with your evolving self. Another clue is judgment, both toward yourself and others. Judgment often points to internalized rules. If you're harsh on yourself for relaxing, you may carry a belief that rest must be earned. If you resent someone for expressing emotions, you may have learned that emotional expression is shameful. Trace the judgment back to its source. Ask yourself, who taught me that?
And, more importantly, do I still believe it? Language can also reveal belief systems. The words you use to describe yourself, lazy, dramatic, selfish, sensitive, failure, are rarely neutral. They carry the weight of cultural meaning. Examine them. Where did those definitions come from? Who benefits from you believing them? Uncovering invisible beliefs is not about blame. It's not about attacking your family or culture or past. It's about agency, about recognizing that even the most deeply rooted narratives can be examined, updated, or let go. You are not disloyal for questioning. You are awake. It's helpful to approach this process with curiosity, not condemnation. Many of these beliefs were survival tools. They helped you make sense of a complicated world. They gave you structure when things felt uncertain. The goal isn't to reject everything old. The goal is to choose what still serves you and discard what doesn't. As you bring these beliefs into the light, you may find yourself feeling disoriented. That's normal. When the foundation shifts, everything above it wobbles. But clarity comes through the discomfort. And with clarity comes freedom. The freedom to live by a framework that's consciously chosen, not unconsciously inherited. Your beliefs shape your reality, but they don't have to be your prison. By examining them, you create space for new interpretations, new behaviors, new possibilities. You stop reacting and start responding. You stop repeating and start rewriting. There's power in naming what once controlled you silently. Power in saying, "This is no longer my truth." Power in choosing beliefs that align with your present, not your past. And perhaps most importantly, there is peace in knowing that you are allowed to change your mind.
Number 36. Subtle self-punishment through procrastination. Procrastination is often framed as a time management problem, a failure of discipline, or a quirk of poor habits. But for many people, the deeper root lies somewhere more emotional, a form of quiet self-sabotage that masks as indecision or distraction. When you look closer, procrastination can become a mirror, revealing patterns of self-punishment that operate under the surface of your choices. You don't always delay tasks because you're lazy or disorganized. Sometimes you delay because finishing would mean confronting discomfort. The discomfort of being seen, the discomfort of setting a new standard, the discomfort of success and its consequences. If you've internalized beliefs that you are unworthy of ease, recognition, or satisfaction, procrastination becomes a way to keep yourself in check. It's not always conscious, but it becomes habitual. You leave things until the last minute, not because you don't care, but because rushing reinforces your sense of being chaotic, behind, or flawed. The stress of urgency gives you a familiar emotional environment, one where guilt and pressure feel normal, even comforting. Completing the task isn't the real challenge. What's hard is sitting with the feeling that you're allowed to do it without suffering. Procrastination can also serve as a buffer against judgment. If you don't give yourself enough time, then any failure can be blamed on the rush. You never have to face the possibility that you tried your best and it still wasn't good enough. Delaying becomes a kind of armor, a way to protect your self-image from the risk of honest evaluation. But in doing so, you deprive yourself of the chance to grow from full effort. There's a subtle logic to this form of self-punishment. If you believe that ease must be earned or that your worth is conditional on performance, then procrastination becomes a form of penance. You make things harder than they need to be. You create pressure and chaos where none is required. You build emotional obstacles not because they're necessary, but because they feel deserved. Sometimes this pattern begins early. If you grew up in an environment where approval was tied to output or where mistakes led to withdrawal or punishment, then delay may have become a way to control the pain. You delay starting because starting means investing, and investing means caring, and caring means it can hurt. So you hover in limbo, present enough to feel the stress, absent enough to avoid the vulnerability of full engagement. Another common layer is identity. If you've been labeled as a procrastinator, a slacker, or someone who never finishes what they start, those labels can become self-fulfilling. You act in ways that reinforce the identity you believe you've been assigned. Not because you agree with it, but deviating from it would require a sense of agency that feels unfamiliar or unsafe. Breaking this cycle doesn't require becoming superhuman. It begins with noticing the emotional function your delay serves. What discomfort does it help you avoid? What narrative does it reinforce? What version of yourself does it protect you from becoming? One of the most effective shifts is to stop framing procrastination as a failure of willpower and start seeing it as a form of inner negotiation. A part of you is protecting another part. A part of you is afraid, uncertain, doubtful. And the task becomes not just finishing a project, but understanding why starting feels like a threat. The answer is rarely to force yourself harder. It's to listen deeper. What would it mean to complete this easily? What would it challenge about how you see yourself? What would it ask you to release? With compassion, you can begin to rewrite the association. You can teach your nervous system that action doesn't need to be preceded by suffering, that finishing something doesn't require a crisis, that you're allowed to succeed without guilt. And perhaps most importantly, that being on time, prepared, or calm does not make you arrogant or fake. It just means you're no longer defining yourself by a story of chaos. Every time you catch yourself in delay, ask, "What am I protecting? And what would happen if I didn't?" You may find that what you feared most wasn't failure. It was expansion. The unfamiliar feeling of letting things be simple, effective, and done.
Number 37. Thought loops that reinforce fear. Fear doesn't always announce itself with panic or urgency. Often, it hides inside patterns of thought that seem rational, even responsible. You review a decision repeatedly. You replay a conversation from hours or days ago. You run simulations in your mind, calculating every outcome, just in case. These thought loops aren't just habits of worry. They are mechanisms that keep fear alive, embedding it deeper into your nervous system through repetition. At first glance, mental looping feels productive. It feels like preparation. You believe that if you just think it through one more time, you'll reach clarity. But clarity never comes. Instead, the more you rehearse the fear, the more familiar it becomes. The mind mistakes repetition for relevance. Because you've thought about it 100 times, it must matter. Because it's always on your mind, it must be real. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle where the fear grows not because the danger is increasing, but because your focus is feeding it. These loops can be especially powerful when connected to uncertainty. Humans are wired to reduce ambiguity. When we don't have enough information, we try to fill in the blanks. But in the absence of data, the mind often defaults to worst-case scenarios. What if I fail? What if they reject me? What if everything falls apart? The loop begins as an attempt to find safety through prediction, but instead of creating safety, it creates paralysis. Sometimes the content of the loop is less important than its emotional tone. It's not just what you're thinking, but how you're thinking. The mind becomes a closed circuit. Each thought triggers the next in a predictable pattern, looping back to the original worry. You may even be aware that you're stuck, but awareness alone doesn't free you. The loop persists because it serves a purpose: to delay action, to avoid risk, to maintain a sense of control. Fear-based thought loops are often born from a deeper lack of trust. Trust in yourself, in your capacity to adapt, in the possibility that things can unfold without your constant intervention. When you don't trust your ability to navigate life as it comes, you try to preempt it.
You live in your head because the world feels too uncertain. You think instead of act. You analyze instead of feel. You rehearse instead of risk. Over time, these loops can become so normalized that they shape your identity. You begin to see yourself as an overthinker, someone who needs more time, more data, more certainty. But this isn't a trait, it's a pattern. And patterns can be interrupted, not by trying to suppress the thoughts, but by changing your relationship to them. The first shift is recognizing that thinking is not always helping. Just because something feels mentally active doesn't mean it's moving you forward. You can ask yourself, is this thought useful? Not true, many fears are true in some sense, but useful. Does this thought help me take action? Does it create clarity? Does it guide me toward a decision I can implement? If the answer is no, then continuing to think it may not be insight, it may be fear in disguise. Another useful question is, what am I avoiding by staying in this loop? Often, the loop is protecting you from a single, simple move: making the call, sending the message, closing the door, opening the new one. But loops keep you in a safe middle space where nothing begins and nothing ends. You can also begin to notice the sensations that accompany looping. Is there tightness in the chest, shallow breathing, a furrowed brow? These cues help you recognize that the mind is not just thinking, it's reacting. When you shift attention to the body, you ground yourself in the present. You exit the loop not by solving it, but by no longer feeding it. These loops eventually collapse when you stop supplying them with attention. Like any cycle, they need energy to survive. When you gently redirect your focus toward the next right step, toward your breath, toward the reality unfolding outside your thoughts, the loop begins to dissolve. Fear loses its grip not because it disappears, but because it no longer controls your mental stage. And in that quiet space beyond the loop, you discover something radical. Not all clarity comes from thinking. Sometimes it comes from doing, from moving, from stepping forward while still uncertain. Because fear will always have something to say. But you don't have to keep listening forever.
Number 38. When emotional distance becomes your default. Emotional distance often begins as a temporary defense. You pull away during a moment of overwhelm, numb out to get through a difficult conversation, or disengage when connection feels unsafe. At first, it's an adaptive strategy, a way to reduce intensity and regain control. But over time, that distance can become more than just a reaction. It becomes a baseline, a default setting, a way of being that no longer feels like a choice, but like your personality. This distance can be hard to detect, especially if you're high-functioning. You can have close relationships, maintain a career, and even appear emotionally intelligent, all while keeping a protective barrier between your inner world and the people around you. You might still participate in emotional moments, but always slightly removed, slightly performative, never fully immersed. You feel things, but at a safe distance. One of the key signs of this default is how you respond to intimacy. Not just romantic intimacy, but emotional closeness of any kind. When someone gets too close, you feel exposed. Not necessarily in a vulnerable way, but in a way that makes you hyper-aware of how you're being perceived. You monitor your expression, you censor your words, you calculate how much of yourself to reveal. And all of this happens beneath the surface, so quietly that even you might not notice it. This distance is often rooted in earlier experiences where emotional exposure was met with consequences. Maybe you opened up and were met with ridicule, silence, or punishment. Maybe your emotional needs were dismissed as inconvenient or overwhelming. In response, you learned to self-contain, to filter, to project strength instead of need. And now, years later, those old strategies remain, not because they still work, but because they're familiar. When emotional distance becomes habitual, it changes your sense of safety.
Closeness starts to feel threatening, not because the people around you are unsafe, but because safety itself has been redefined. You feel safer when there's space, when there's ambiguity, when your emotions remain unspoken. You might long for deep connection, but when it approaches, your system recoils, not from dislike, but from dissonance. Because something in you believes that real closeness demands a level of exposure you're not sure you can survive. This pattern doesn't mean you lack empathy or emotional capacity. In fact, many people who default to distance are deeply sensitive. They feel too much, not too little. But because they don't trust that those feelings will be held, they suppress them. They channel emotion into productivity, humor, analysis, anything that allows them to stay adjacent to their feelings without fully entering them. Over time, emotional distance can lead to a kind of quiet isolation. You're never fully alone, but you're never fully met. People may admire your composure, your independence, your calm, but few will know what's actually going on inside. And if you've been emotionally distant long enough, you might not either. You've practiced self-containment for so long that accessing your own emotional truth requires effort, reflection, permission. The antidote to emotional distance isn't forced vulnerability. It's curiosity. It's learning to notice when you pull away, not to judge it, but to understand it. What emotion are you avoiding? What discomfort are you trying to manage? What past experience does this remind you of? These questions don't require you to change your behavior right away. They simply help you name what's happening. Small acts of emotional honesty can begin to shift the default. Sharing a genuine reaction instead of a filtered one. Letting silence exist without filling it. Admitting when something affects you, even if you're not ready to process it. These are subtle moves, but over time, they soften the rigid edges of distance. They remind your nervous system that presence and protection aren't mutually exclusive. It's also important to understand that emotional openness isn't a constant state. No one is available all the time. The goal isn't to be endlessly expressive, but to have access to your emotional life when it matters. To know that you can move toward closeness without losing yourself. To allow others in without surrendering your sense of autonomy. When emotional distance is no longer your default, connection becomes less about performance and more about participation. You stop managing impressions and start revealing truth. You stop filtering for safety and start relating with sincerity. And in that shift, something profound happens. Your relationships become mirrors, not masks. Spaces where you are seen not for how well you manage emotion, but for how fully you inhabit it. That doesn't mean you'll always feel comfortable. It just means you'll feel present. And in the end, presence, not perfection, is what makes connection real.
Number 39. The compulsion to make everything make sense. Humans are meaning makers. We scan our environment, piece together information, and form stories that help us understand what's happening and why. This capacity is essential. It allows us to navigate the world with some sense of coherence. But this same strength can turn into a trap when it becomes compulsive. When the need to make everything make sense overrides the ability to simply experience what is. When the search for explanation replaces the acceptance of complexity. At its core, the compulsion to make sense is an attempt to regain control. When something unpredictable happens, especially something emotionally charged, your mind begins working overtime. It reconstructs timelines. It revisits conversations. It imagines alternate outcomes. And most of all, it asks why. Why did this happen? Why did they say that? Why do I feel this way? These questions seem like a path to clarity, but often they're a form of resistance. A way to delay grief, avoid ambiguity, or protect yourself from the discomfort of not knowing. This compulsion shows up in many forms. After a breakup, you might replay every detail, looking for the moment it started to fall apart. After a professional setback, you might search for a hidden pattern to explain your misstep. Even in daily interactions, you might overanalyze someone's tone or behavior, trying to decode their intention. And in all these moments, your nervous system feels slightly safer. Because even if the explanation isn't accurate, it's something. It's a frame, a story, a way to feel like you're not floating in the unknown. But making sense isn't always the same as making peace. In fact, the two can be at odds. When you demand that every experience fit into a narrative, you shrink its complexity. You reduce people to roles: the villain, the victim, the fool. You turn your own feelings into puzzles to be solved rather than signals to be felt. And slowly, the richness of lived experience gets filtered through a narrow lens of logic. This is particularly true when the emotions involved are uncomfortable. Sadness, betrayal, disappointment, these are hard to sit with. So instead of feeling them directly, the mind tries to organize them. It categorizes, it rationalizes. It creates stories not just about what happened, but about what it means about you. And often those meanings are harsh. I'm unlovable. I always ruin things. This proves I'm not enough. The story feels true not because it is, but because it's emotionally charged, because it gives form to the chaos. The compulsion to make sense also stems from cultural conditioning. Many of us are taught to value clarity over confusion, to solve problems rather than sit with them. Ambiguity is seen as failure, doubt is seen as weakness. As a result, we learn to fear the liminal spaces, the transitions, the in-betweens, the moments that don't resolve. But those are often the moments that shape us the most. Not because they gave us answers, but because they forced us to grow without them. Letting go of this compulsion doesn't mean giving up understanding. It means widening your tolerance for uncertainty. It means allowing multiple truths to exist at once. It means recognizing that not everything will make perfect sense. And that's not a problem to fix, it's a reality to accept. Life is layered. People are contradictory. Emotions don't always follow logic. And meaning, when it comes, often arrives later, unexpectedly, quietly, and without explanation. Instead of asking, "Why did this happen?" you can ask, "What is this asking of me?" Instead of needing a clear answer, you can practice curiosity, openness, presence. You can begin to see your mind's storytelling as just that, a story, useful sometimes, misleading other times. Not a fact, but a lens. One that can be put down when it no longer serves. And when you do, something changes. You stop fighting the unknown. You stop needing every feeling to be justified, every action to be labeled, every interaction to be explained. You allow space for ambiguity, not as a failure of clarity, but a feature of depth. You begin to trust not just what you know, but what you don't. Because some things aren't meant to be solved. They're meant to be lived.
Number 40. The final barrier. You don't need permission to evolve. There comes a point in your personal development when the question is no longer, "How do I grow?" but, "What am I waiting for?" At the surface, it may look like you're still searching for tools, insight, or clarity. But underneath that search, there's often a quiet, invisible threshold. The sense that you're not quite allowed to change. Not yet. Not until something grants you permission, approval from others, certainty in your path, or resolution of the past. And so you wait, silently, indefinitely. This final barrier isn't external. It's not a lack of resources or opportunity. It's a psychological boundary built from inherited messages. Messages that tell you growth must be earned, that you need to be ready, that becoming someone new is only valid if your past self is somehow completed, healed, or neatly understood. It's the feeling that you must justify your evolution to the people around you, that if they don't see the need for change, maybe you're imagining it. Maybe it's safer to stay the same. This barrier is subtle because it disguises itself as humility, as patience, as maturity. You tell yourself you're taking your time, doing it the right way. But often what you're really doing is deferring your life to the comfort of other people's expectations. You've internalized the idea that transformation must be explained, approved, or witnessed. That change without consensus is selfish, reckless, or invalid. But evolution doesn't follow social timelines. It doesn't wait for understanding or applause. It moves quietly, through questions that keep returning, through discomfort that doesn't go away, through the ache of becoming someone your old self never planned to be. The truth is, no one will ever fully see what you see inside yourself. No one can validate an inner shift they haven't felt. So if you're waiting for someone to tell you it's okay to change, that wait will never end. Because permission to evolve is not given, it's claimed. Part of the challenge lies in the fear of consequence. Change often threatens relationships, routines, and roles. You worry, what if people think I'm abandoning them? What if I fail? What if I don't recognize myself on the other side? These are valid fears, but they're not reasons to delay. They're signs that you're stepping into unfamiliar territory, which is exactly where growth lives. Every significant transformation comes with uncertainty. The work is to expand your tolerance for that uncertainty without shrinking your vision to fit your past. Another dimension of this barrier is loyalty, not just to others, but to the person you've always been, the narratives you've always told, the identities that once kept you safe. You think, if I change, does that mean who I was before was wrong? But growth doesn't negate your past. It includes it. It honors what it gave you and what it couldn't. You're not betraying your old self by evolving. You're fulfilling what that self began. To move through this final barrier, you don't need grand declarations. You don't need a moment of absolute clarity. You just need to stop waiting for permission. You need to begin acting as though your growth is valid simply because it's calling to you, because it feels true, because it won't leave you alone. That's enough. That's always been enough. When you release the need to be granted transformation, you begin to embody it. You stop explaining your journey to people who can't walk it with you. You stop minimizing your insights to avoid discomfort. You start living from the version of you that knows what needs to shift and doesn't ask for approval. This isn't defiance, it's maturity. It's the quiet knowing that your life belongs to you, that your path doesn't require unanimous agreement, that the world won't pause to catch up to your new self, and it doesn't have to. You're allowed to grow without being understood. You're allowed to choose without being certain. You're allowed to evolve just because something inside you is ready. Because ultimately, evolution is not a permission slip. It's a decision, one only you can make.